Tonight, in the seemingly quiet town of Lowminster, a single line in the parish magazine stirs a ripple of unease. 5 guineas for the church roof, gifted by an anonymous hand calling itself Only House with No Address. Is it a harmless kindness, a sly warning, or the first whisper of a deeper plot? Before we turn the first page, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? What's your go-to late-night snack for a mystery? And are you the sort who solves the case before the inspector, or waits to be surprised? Lowminster's parish magazine presented itself with its usual air of compulsory cheerfulness, a quality produced by the editor's belief that optimism could be bundled like kindling and handed round. Lowminster's parish magazine presented itself with its usual air of compulsory cheerfulness, a quality produced by the editor's belief that optimism could be bundled like kindling and handed round. The pages, stapled with a solemnity one associates with minor legal documents, clung together as damp laundry sometimes does when it has not been told to behave. Among the notices, raffles in need of someone sensible to mind the float. A boiler appeal that was, temperamentally, the same as last year's but with less faith in thermodynamics. A column of births whose commas had been placed by a hand distrustful of restraint. There appeared a line of accidental literature. Anonymous benefactor, house with no address, 5 guineas for church roof. The words achieved, without intending it, that condition of wit in which an absurdity has the nerve to pass as good manners. The Reverend Ambrose Chivers, a man who had long understood how easily piety could be frightened, smiled with pastoral caution. Mrs. Priddy, the treasurer, who divided her respect equally between arithmetic and providence, the former rarely disappointing her, tapped the entry with an index finger that had done sterling work for the Mothers' Union and could still make a plate of buns confess its ingredients. Mr. Skimpole, volunteer editor and public zealot for hyphens, contemplated the phrase house with no address as a poet might consider a rhyme that had wandered in from a better stanza. 5 guineas, he observed, as if pronouncing on the moral condition of the amount. One doesn't hear of them now unless horses or surgeons are involved, or the arts, which are becoming indistinguishable from both. It is generous, said Mrs. Priddy, whose generosity took the shape of lists. Although anonymous generosity would be tidier if it didn't insist upon being so coy. One cannot write a thank you note to something that refuses to stand still. Reverend Chivers suggested that perhaps gratitude could occur, like grace, invisibly. Mrs. Priddy allowed that while this was theologically unimpeachable, it was not, from a treasurer's perspective, convenient. It was in this spirit, half devout, half bookkeeping, that the vicar rang, the police station, asking not for help but for reassurance of the civil variety. Whether an address that declined to be an address could still be banked. The telephone, which had suffered higher calls on its patients, transmitted the question to Inspector Purbright, who happened at that hour to be conducting his daily review of correspondence, a literature that Lowminster produced in quantities disproportionate to its sins. Money, Purbright told the receiver, in a tone that never startled it, is seldom addressable, only traceable. He added that he would come round, as the weather recommended the vicarage. There were parts of town in which rain had become an ideology, and that if there was an envelope, he wished to see it. The vicarage had been built in that era, when clerical accommodation assumed vicars bred like primroses and therefore required stairs. The drawing-room presented tea and neutrality. It wore lace antimacassars with an air of principled acceptance. On a small table lay the parish magazine, a plate of ginger biscuits given to remorse, and the envelope. Purbright considered it without touching. He possessed that happy faculty, invaluable in policemen and surgeons, of appearing to examine without appearing to accuse. The address, typed Parish Roof Fund, arranged with a modesty that nearly amounted to taste. The words, house with no address, were on a slip enclosed, the vicar explained, to guide our thanks into more edifying channels. The stamp had been licked by a person who treated saliva as a civil resource. There was no evidence of extravagance. The flap's neatness suggested instruction rather than habit. It had been pressed down evenly, one could almost say correctly. "You will have seen the cheque," said Mrs. Priddy, who regarded all envelopes as cocoons destined to become receipts. "A postal order," said the Reverend, "for the very sum, payable to the parish roof fund. It arrived 2 days ago. I took the liberty of having it included in the magazine's entries so that, he concluded, as if confiding something to God, others might feel emboldened." "Embarrassed," said Mr. Simpole cheerfully. "Embarrassed is the parish word for emboldened, Inspector. 2 sides of the same pudding." "If embarrassment repairs the roof," Mrs. Priddy replied, "I shall allow it a prominent place in the ledger." Purbright asked for the envelope, and this was produced with the air of a relic being shown to a discreet pilgrim. He turned it gently. The typing bore the signs of old-fashioned discipline. The lines were justified by someone who remembered that the margin was a moral category. The ribbon had not been sparing. Letters showed no anemia. On the back, in the flap, a watermark, Eversley Bond, £22. He knew the type. Provincial stationers had produced it in sufficient quantity to outlast strong opinions. He noted, too, a small pressure mark at the lower left corner, as if the typist had, out of habit, steadied the paper there with a ringless finger before closing the carriage. "Would you say," asked the vicar, in the tone of one greeting an over-educated angel, "that the person is known to us?" "In Lowminster," said Purbright, "it is the unknown who give themselves away. The known have been doing so for years and grew tired." This received the requisite smile from the Reverend and the disapproval that smiles receive from treasurers. Purbright replaced the envelope precisely where it had been. Objects, he believed, had better memories for position than people did. In the kitchen, where the housekeeper leaned on the authority of her apron, tea achieved that virtue which English people confuse with taste. There were biscuits that had made sacrifices. Conversation circled the question of anonymity with the courtesy one extends to visiting clergy. "I shall, of course," said Mrs. Priddy, "issue a receipt." "To what address?" asked the inspector. "To the next magazine," she said after a moment's righteous battle. "There is no harm in publishing gratitude. It serves as both thanksgiving and advertisement." The Reverend, whose intimacy with moral paradox had not improved his ability to enjoy it, asked whether there was any procedure the police would recommend. "Only the ordinary," said Purbright, "which is often the most successful. If the person wishes to be anonymous, they will continue until they do not. In the meantime, we may watch how other people react. It is generally more informative." This being a police method that did not distress the parish's digestion, there was general relief. Purbright took his leave with an assurance that he would speak with the post-mistress at his convenience, a phrase that in Lowminster had always recommended itself as both promise and postponement. At the station, Sergeant Malley sat at his desk in the condition many sergeants occupy between paperwork, a readiness that has had to make its peace with waiting. He looked up with a politeness that had been taught to him by institutions. "Anonymous roof fund, sir?" "House with no address," said Purbright. "One of those civic jokes that begins as a footnote and ends as a file." "Will we be needing a photograph?" Malley asked without hope. "I suspect not. What we require is a map of other people's intentions." Malley recorded this, if not philosophically, then at least mechanically, in the plain book he kept for thoughts that did not know what they wanted to be yet. He was a good man for maps. His lines were straight and his arrows did not agitate. "Guineas," he said after a pause. "Odd way to think." "Not odd," said Purbright. "Just disciplined by a past that never apologized for itself. Auction rooms, professional fees, good silver, better manners, a mind trained to reckon in reputation as well as coin. Someone old, then? Or someone with an old person's manners," said Purbright. "Not always the same thing." He regarded the envelope again, which he had placed on his desk with the careful indifference of a man refusing to flirt with it. There is a neatness that wishes to be admired without being noticed. He rang the bank, having cultivated over the years the kind of cordial relations that are achieved by never asking for more than one is probably entitled to. Mr. Bunn, the manager, possessed a voice that sounded as though it had been warmed by keys. Yes, he had seen a postal order in that amount. No, he could not speak to its purchaser with a clarity that would please the inspector, as cash had been offered, and the clerk who took it had taken it from a pair of gloves that suggested exposure to fresh air rather than labor. Fine leather, he added, in a color the better sort of catalogues call fawn. The signature on the purchase form was merely an initial and a surname with an opinion of itself. He would, of course, be happy to oblige further if the matter turned from curiosity to necessity. Curiosity, said Purbright, often turns into necessity after a decent interval. He thanked Mr. Bunn and replaced the receiver. He then called upon Mr. Simpole, whose editorial office consisted of a side room at the church hall, furnished with folding chairs that had seen more collapses than their fair share, and a typewriter covered as if modesty applied to machines. The editor unveiled it with an affection that bordered on the domestic. "I do not," he said, unasked, "type anonymous benefactions. I only place them. It is a distinction like many in public life, essential to those who make it." The machine, a portable of those bleak years when manufacturers imagined the future would be both grey and efficient, offered an alphabet that tilted slightly to the right when tired. Purbright examined a proof. The commas drooped modestly, as if unwilling to be noticed for too long. He held the anonymous envelope beside the page. The difference was the difference between tidy and punctilious. The benefactor's typing had a schoolmaster's patience. Mr. Simpole's possessed the stubborn charm of someone who had taught himself to do without patience. "You will have observed," said the editor, whose vanity was the sort that liked being anticipated, "that 'house with no address' is a phrase likely to stir the town. People here have a taste for morals that leave footprints." "They prefer the footprints to belong to someone else," said Purbright, which Mr. Simpole, as a connoisseur of indirect compliments, permitted himself to enjoy. Outside, Lowminster managed the rain in its accustomed way, which was to pretend it had ordered it and was not surprised. Mrs. Priddy crossed the square with a bag that could chastise a ledger. The newsagent had propped a cardboard display of chocolate against a postcard view of the town that had not yet forgiven the century for occurring. Two ladies in waterproofs discussed the magazine in a manner that proved gossip, when conducted professionally, could lower its voice to a whisper more cutting than clarity. "Anonymous," said the first, "is what people are when they have something to be thanked for." "Or blamed," said the second, who had known the town longer. At home, the postal order's counterfoil lay on the vicarage desk under the weight of a hymn book that spoke sternly to its own spine. Purbright had examined it earlier without moving it. He remembered the imprint left upon the blotter beneath. Some typists press, others kissed the keys. This one had pressed the commas hard enough to make small half-moons, regular as a school lesson. He had seen such comma discipline before on committee minutes where dignity had to be manufactured for the lack of substance. By late afternoon, he had done what a principled policeman does at the beginning, very little that looks like anything. He had resisted the temptation to convert mystery into effort. He had allowed the matter to begin telling him its story, for stories, in his experience, forced to perform too soon, conceal themselves out of spite. He opened his office window an inch, to share the air with the municipal geranium dying honorably on the sill. The envelope remained on the desk, reproachful only to those who had never been reproached by an envelope. He looked again at the watermark, Eversley Bond, and at the faintest trace of scent which the rain had made more rather than less apparent. Lavender, not the daring modern kind, but that earlier strain which had served wardrobes and inhibitions for half a century. One would meet it in drawers that contained spare napkins and in houses that believed sunlight was more of an idea than a hygiene. He closed the window, and after a moment, the file. On the inside cover he wrote, without underlining, "House with no address, roof fund." Beneath that, "Guineas, Eversley bond," commas pressed. He would, he told himself, visit the post office next and the bank again later with no fuss. He would ask 2 or 3 people who habitually knew more than they admitted. He would look at minutes in which the phrases had the weary exactness of repetition. Before he left for the day, he took the envelope up once more, balancing it by its edges as if it had applied for membership of the force, and he had to judge its posture. On the back, lower left, the pressure mark he had noticed made a tiny dent, triangular, not accidental. Stationers sometimes cut a notch to indicate a particular stock batch. Conscientious secretaries learned to place their fingers there to steady, a habit survived by the work long after the employment. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, like the way certain people pronounce address with stress on the first syllable to persuade it toward virtue. He set the envelope down. In the quiet that follows the conclusion of small matters, he recognized the absence of one large one. There was, among the town's industrious committees and corrective charities, perhaps a single pair of hands that had trained a circle of others in the use of paper, ribbon, and applause. The thought did not alarm him. It turned in his mind the way a coin turns in the pocket of a man who prefers to pay discreetly. On the desk blotter, the pressed half-moons of commas regarded him with the composure of punctuation that knows its place. He found himself wondering, not impatiently, merely as one counts the steps to the kettle, whose hand had taught them. And because the rain chose that moment to stop, the room altered its light, and the lavender thinned to a suggestion. The inspector, who had a taste for suggestions over statements, made a brief note of the change. It was, he supposed, a beginning, not of a case in the dramatic sense. Lowminster left those to the counties that needed excitement for self-respect, but of a manner. A house without an address had sent money. Somewhere, surely, there was an address without a house. The council chamber had the washed patience of rooms that have survived many purposes and ended with the least exciting of them. Its fluorescent tubes bled their penitence on varnished chairs. The long table was covered in a cloth of municipal green that had learned to forgive elbows. A framed photograph of a former chairman regarded these late descendants of civic conscience with the resigned generosity of a person who knows how small triumphs are minted. Members arrived at a pace designed to show they had not hurried and therefore could be trusted. The clerk, Miss Pegg, an efficient woman whose spectacles implied legality without claiming it, arranged papers into obedient battalions. Beside her, a metal box of minute books waited to receive another of its thin slices of local immortality. Mr. Lockett, chairman, wore his chain of office under his jacket in deference to a doctrine of humility he liked to quote. The chain's absence from view did not diminish his sense of borough-size importance. It merely improved his circulation. Inspector Purbright, invited for community liaison and thus made temporarily decorative, took the seat set aside for observers. He possessed, on these occasions, the air of a person visiting a polite household where the family's sorrow is not to be mentioned until the second cup of tea. Business opened in the usual manner, which is to say, with an admiration of minutes. The reading of the previous session, verge-cutting resolved, pending an exploration of verge identity. Bin placements considered in light of the elderly's proxemics. A motion to improve the signage around the duck pond withdrawn when the ducks proved competent, was delivered by Miss Pegg in a voice that allowed punctuation to take its rightful share of the room. Approval arose in murmurs. Dissent had lost interest. The agenda proceeded. A farmer's hedge had, according to a distressed resident, entered the public way with an arrogance that was not to be borne. It had not, Mr. Lockett thought, been proved that hedges possessed temperaments, but they certainly had habits. A working party would see to it that no habit offended. Then the item. Miss Pegg lifted a single sheet as one might exhibit an unwise photograph to the family. "Correspondence," she said. "A letter to the council from—" Here she paused, either for effect or composure. "House with no address." At the phrase there was that attractive movement bodies make when a collective nervous system pretends to be individual. Chairs tapped gently backwards. Papers rose slightly like bibs. Mr. Locket cleared his throat in a manner that gave the impression of preparing a verdict for history. Mr. Mallow, who owned the grocers and behaved as if groceries were a moral proposition, sat very straight. He was not easily surprised by letters. Supplies ordered their own rebukes. Miss Pegg read. The voice was even, the punctuation grateful for service. "It has been noticed by several of us who observe the rhythm of Sunday that Mr. Mallow's premises have remained open beyond a time compatible with reverence. Furthermore, sandwiches offered for sale after evensong, ham among them, encourage young people to imagine that worship concludes in slices. It would be a kindness to the town were such practices regularized toward sobriety. Signed, House with no address." A small color, official blush rather than personal embarrassment, appeared on Miss Pegg's cheeks. She lowered the letter with a carefulness that did it credit. Mr. Locket exhaled the sort of breath public men say for reproof delivered without recourse to anger. "Well," he said, "we must not pretend the matter lacks seriousness. It is the custom of Lowminster to be both civil and correct." "Ham," said Mr. Mallow, not rising, "is not a narcotic." "No," agreed Mr. Locket, "but the youth combine ham with ideas, and that can be intoxicating." He turned to the clerk. "We thank the correspondent, however unidentifiable, for calling our attention to the delicate line where comfort and conscience meet. Inspector, you will understand, I am sure, how these things trouble a community such as ours." Purbright allowed that he did. His face wore the neutrality that prevents weather from thinking it has had an effect. "I wonder," he said mildly, "who usually receives anonymous indignation in Lowminster." "All of us," said Mr. Locket, pleased to be comprehensive, though rarely with such elegance. He touched the paper as though hoping to absorb a little of its grace. "There is a style about this." "There is," Purbright said. He did not mention that style can be as communal as guilt. Procedure demanded a response, and response demanded the impression of action. The council debated, without any untidy appearance of debate, whether shop hours must be harmonized with a Sabbath whose clock had not been wound recently. Someone proposed a guidance note rather than a bylaw, as guidance could be ignored in a way that felt principled. It was agreed that sandwiches, if sold late, should at least be discreet, as if secrecy within wax paper improved morality. "Perhaps," ventured Miss Pegg, "a notice might be drafted for shopkeepers." Nothing condemnatory, more in the nature of encouragement to be exemplary. "Exemplarity," said Mr. Locket, tasting the word, "is a quality this council is well placed to recommend." "I am always pleased," said Mr. Mallow, who had recognized his defeat the moment it became politeness, "to be exemplary in any way that doesn't injure my customers' digestion. You see," Mr. Locket told no one in particular, "how Lowminster conducts itself, with mutual respect and the minimum of ulcers." The letter passed from hand to hand. Each reader noted, though none would have called it noting, the exactness of the typing. The lines had been justified with the sort of patience one does not expect from youth, which has better ambitions for its time. The strokes were clean. Commas were pressed into the paper as though the typist believed punctuation was a small form of character. There was no error corrected by overtype. There was no looseness of margin that would betray a relaxed conscience. On the envelope, the council had kept it too, as one keeps a shell when the sea has become theoretical, the address was formed with the same tidy will. The stamp sat precisely square. At the back, The flap had been closed with the conviction of a person who had long ago selected permanence over adventure. A faint fragrance, reminiscent of wardrobes that had survived a generation's scruples, rose when the paper was flexed. Or it might have been the cloth on the table. Sensible rooms gather scent from the company they keep. "Shall I min it?" asked Miss Pegg, pen poised, "that the council thanks the correspondent for its interest and will consider guidance on shop hours following evensong?" "Minute it," said Mr. Locket, "and ensure the tone is neither craven nor defiant. We must avoid seeming to be bullied by benevolence." The phrase satisfied everyone. The pen moved with brisk small strokes that made a civil contradiction to the machine's measured vigor. Purbright, from his place, watched the clerk as one watches a pianist choose between fingering and performance. Her hands were narrow. The right thumbnail bore a triangle of polish worn away at the edge, as if a paper knife had acquired more of her attention than a man might reasonably require. On the blotter, beneath the letter, a shallow impression of a previous sheet had left half-moon dents where commas once pressed, like footprints around a hesitation. Other items resumed their patience. A motion to purchase a new kettle for the halls. Kitchen was carried, the old kettle having boiled itself into allegory. A question on the sighting of a grit bin produced briefly the sort of passion usually reserved for anniversaries. Under any other business, Mrs. Dearden of the Women's Institute rose not so much to speak as to demonstrate that speaking could be performed without remark. She hoped standards might continue to be maintained in the matter of uniforms at the fete stalls. Some girls, she had noticed, wore shoes less interested in respectability than in surfaces. It was during this recital that Purbright leaned very slightly towards the clerk. "You receive many letters of this description?" he asked, in a tone that intended nothing beyond companionship. "Some," said Miss Pegg. "They often come to me by way of the council post bag. People imagine the clerk a sort of sieve that keeps the stones of discourtesy out of the town's teeth." "And do these stones arrive with stamps, or do they walk themselves?" "Most are stamped," she said, "and nearly all typed. Handwriting is considered too intimate, perhaps, for indignation." "Typed where, do you suppose?" "In the town," she said. "One can tell the speed of a letter by the steadiness of its edges." She smiled, because the remark had sounded nearly like humor, and one hears the age and the patience of justification. "Quite," said Purbright. "Who supplies your type ribbons, Miss Pegg?" She looked down at her machine as if it might have feelings on the matter. "Bunton's," she said, naming the stationer with whom Lowminster kept its obligations. "They account well and arrange promptly. Do you prefer black only, or the black-red?" "Black only," she replied, gently offended by the suggestion of drama. "We are not the Treasury." Mr. Locket, who had reached the part of proceedings where comments could be safely striking without consequence, encouraged the inspector to offer a view as an observer and as a person whose view has been known to be useful. "I wonder," Purbright said, "whether the council might consider the merit of a small notice in the parish magazine. Not a reprimand. A request that future correspondence seeking civic improvements might include a way of being thanked properly." "The house with no address," said Mr. Locket, reflecting, "is proof that some people wish to be thanked by history rather than by post." He nodded. "Very well. Miss Pegg, a brief announcement. Something along the lines of, 'Council welcomes suggestions. Courteous identification assists resolution.'" "Assists resolution," repeated the clerk, writing. The phrase satisfied her standards as completely as it concealed them. They adjourned in the time-honored manner, which was to say, they ceased without admitting it. Chairs were replaced by persons whose moral architecture did not permit scraping. In the lobby, the air was cooler and easier for words. Mr. Mallow, catching up to Purbright with the practiced speed of a man who has learned to reach customers before their resolutions do, gave him a small smile. "If a parish cannot survive ham," he said, "Inspector, I have underestimated salvation. It will survive." said Purbright. "It may even improve." He considered the man's face, which had grown used to lengthy politenesses. "Tell me, do you recall any custom in your time here of anonymous complaint more lyrical than practical?" "It used to come by rumor," Mr. Mallow said. "In the old days, someone would tell you that someone else had been told something about your morals. Now it arrives with a stamp. Progress has made courtesy heavier." Across the hall, Miss Pegg bent to place the letter into a thin file she marked Correspondence General. The file's tab was labeled in a hand that made even vowels look tidy. As she pressed the metal prongs closed, the envelope's corner revealed briefly a small triangular dent at the back, very like the imperfection Purbright had seen the previous day on the vicar's letter. The shape was the size of a habit, and as easy to overlook. "Good evening, Inspector," called Mr. Lockett, holding the door with a gallantry that had been one of his better investments. "We are grateful for your attendance. It keeps us sound to be observed." "It keeps us particular," said Purbright. He walked out into Lowminster's version of night, which was a daylight that had agreed to be quiet. The square held its breath in the moderate way squares do when they are thinking about propriety. Above the newsagents, the council's notice board presented its typed announcements in a fashion that suggested the town had adopted printing as a moral exercise. A discarded sandwich paper flapped against the bench and then thought better of it. Back at the station, he laid the new envelope beside the first. The same stock, the same correct stamp, the same justification in the paragraphs. Margins that could have been used to set an example. He rubbed his thumb lightly over the paper until the faint smell of lavender, drawers, not fields, returned. The scent was not a perfume so much as a practice. On the blotter where he had set the clerk's draft notice, the sheet she had left with him for liaison, the comma prints were a shade deeper than usual, as if someone had insisted punctuation must be experienced as well as observed. He had noticed, too, that while she read the house letter, her right forefinger, almost absently, traced a small notch at the corner of the envelope, a notch a habit might find without assistance. He recorded none of this yet. He permitted the details to stand in a provisional way inside his head, like chairs arranged before a meeting decides whether it is really necessary. He was not prepared to say the clerk wrote the letters, or that she even knew who did. The town's patience suggested a circle wider than one pair of hands. There were echoes of older instruction, the schoolroom under an alderman's portrait, the steadying of paper by a ringless finger, and the insistence that commas be pressed rather than tapped. He closed the file and, out of habit, squared it. At the window, the street lamp whitened the evening as if it distrusted color. Purbright stood a moment, hearing the council's voices strengthening into memory. Somewhere a kettle announced itself as a conclusion. He reached for his pen and wrote a single line beneath his earlier notes. Peg, ribbons from buntons, commas, heavy, triangular, notch familiar. Then he stopped, not so much because he had reached an end as because the next thought refused to be rushed. Whoever had taught Lowminster to scold so beautifully had also taught it to use paper well. Whether the council would be grateful for that education remained, like the sandwiches after evensong, a matter of timing. Miss Ferry's post office belonged to that class of establishments which attempt to make national purpose look domestic. Its glassed counter had been polished into a moral, and the framed notice exhorting customers to remain calm had so long contemplated Lowminster that it had forgotten why. Behind the counter, on shelves that were unafraid of labels, packets of envelopes arranged themselves by weight and intention. A rack of postcards featuring the church spire from an angle preferred by committees, turned with the faint obstinacy of a conscience. Miss Ferry herself managed the premises with a tidiness that suggested both calling and prophylactic. She believed, as much from experience as from temperament, that a town delivered regularly would behave better than one left to fetch itself. Her hair was arranged not so much to please as to reassure. Her spectacles stood at a point on the nose that had made its peace with authority. She greeted Inspector Purbright as one greets a man who comes indoors without bringing weather with him. "If you wish to see the ledger, Inspector, we shall not keep it waiting," she said, producing a book that had more entries than adventures. "You will understand that in Lowminster our geography is improved by the post. It persuades people to declare where they think they are." Purbright allowed that this was true. He had always thought letters a kind of map that refused to admit it. He glanced around the small public space where civic errand and private habit overlapped without speaking. A woman buying stamps considered whether charity required first class. A man asking for a money order wore the cautious expression of those about to do something sound. The wall clock, Miss Ferry's chief assistant, displayed 10:30 with the air of one who had never been wrong. "I should like," he said, "to understand your memory of several recent letters." They came to the parish council and the vicarage from a correspondent styling itself House, with no address. "Ah," said Miss Ferry, who distrusted novelty that arrived modestly. "One recalls those, franked at 8:30 in the mornings, an hour, Inspector, when true benevolence is tidy. That is when the serious senders attend to their duties before opinions have grown noisy." "8:30 by which clock?" asked Purbright mildly. "By the post office," she replied, as if the question were a metaphysical test she had passed. "Our clock receives correction with the first collection. It is a firm arrangement." He nodded. The phrase "receives correction" had the tone of a marriage that had grown into a principle. Miss Ferry placed upon the counter a small tray containing the detritus of service. Twine, a pencil that had been reduced to practicality, a rubber stamp with a date that looked embarrassed by renewal. She touched the stamp with 2 capable fingers. These letters bore no return address. The envelopes were of respectable stock, watermarked, I think, though I cannot swear to the exact name. The typing was of the old school, lines justified, commas pressed, and no vulgar haste. Postage. Always correct. We do not see underpayments from people who wish to improve others. It would be inconsistent. And the typing, same machine each time. Most of them, yes. One letter showed a fading ribbon, the characters becoming a little faint at the tail end. The next, later that week, arrived with the ribbon newly replaced. "The difference," she added, with the pleasure of an observation warming itself in accuracy, "was like the difference between starch and steam." Purbright smiled gravely. "And who was seen bringing the letters?" Miss Ferry adjusted a sheet of forms as a prelude to an answer. "One does not always see. The morning frank belongs to the town's better angels and its earlier anxieties. Some place items in the pillar box at the corner. Some hand them to me while consulting the notices. But in the matter of council post, Mr. Pallister collects the delivery bag most mornings. He's a widower who helps in any enterprise that does not require him to talk. I've found the quality useful." "He speaks little?" "He saves it," she said. "When he wishes to offer an opinion, he writes it down for the clerk. It makes him admirable, if a trifle cumbersome." "Do you recall him posting anything on behalf of an anonymous house?" "I recall him carrying envelopes that avoided eye contact," said Miss Ferry, which passed for fanciful in her vocabulary. "He is punctual at 8:20 and again at 9. His shoes make no sound upon the step. One supposes love made him a considerate man, and loss made him efficient." She opened the ledger and set it down between them as if introducing 2 reserved people. The entries showed the life of the town rendered into ink. Letters, parcels, orders, a procession of small obligations. Purbright saw in it what he generally did in records, a set of decisions pretending to be a list. He traced a finger, not touching, only indicating, along the lines of the past fortnight. Parcels had travelled to the library, the church, and the Women's Institute. They had been paid for in cash, the notes described by Miss Ferry as crisp to the point of education. Next to each transaction, in the space where the sender's signature or name is encouraged, there appeared the same generous looped hand. It belonged to a person who corrected others kindly and often. "Do you know the hand?" he asked. "We see it on minutes and on notices occasionally," said Miss Ferry. "It is a hand that believes in the moral advantages of legibility. The letters lean a little forward like someone practiced at entering rooms." "Male or female?" "The letters are courteous," Miss Ferry replied, closing the category pleasantly. He continued down the page. There was no inbound mail for anything so determinedly homeless as house with no address. "Naturally," said Miss Ferry, "as it wouldn't know where to live. We do not forward limbo." "Of course," said Purbright. He made a small notation in his mind where the clock kept hers. Someone is counting on precisely that. He asked to see the day's bag for the council. Miss Ferry produced it, a canvas pouch with a strap that retained in its weave the memory of more shoulders than it had right to. Inside, among brown envelopes addressed with respectable anonymity, lay several items stamped in the previous hour. The paper smelt of storerooms and of the kind of lavender that has served more as a practice than as a perfume. One envelope, thicker than its neighbors, bore a typed label with the calm correctness that had grown familiar. "Parish Council, for attention of the clerk." The lettering exhibited that habit of pressing commas as if to insist upon pauses in other people. "Routine correspondence," said Miss Ferry, who never relegated responsibility to chance. "I shall have Mr. Pallister take it at 11:15. He prefers to arrive just before the second collection so that the day may be considered in halves." "Do you supply typewriter ribbons?" asked Purbright. "Certainly not," said Miss Ferry, with the mild affront of a woman whose shop declines to be dragged into the present. "Bunton's does. We sell what people cannot do without. The stationer sells what they believe they cannot do without. It is a division of labor as old as the town." "Do you recall anyone purchasing a ribbon recently?" "Black only. No red." "Such items are purchased over the counter at Bunton's," she repeated, "where gossip is always sold with the goods. You might ask him to discover how much he knows by accident." A customer, having decided to find charity economical, requested a book of stamps. Miss Ferry attended to her with a speed that managed to be both efficient and forgiving. Purbright turned a page back in the ledger and found last month's receipts. The same hand, the same loops, on payments addressed to the library for accessions, to the church for stationery for proper acknowledgments, to the Women's Institute for furnishings as discussed. The adverb properly reappeared in different guises, a sort of ethical parsley sprinkled everywhere. "You don't often see cash this fresh," Purbright remarked. "Some people fold money with more care than they fold opinions," said Miss Ferry. "It is admirable. Or contagious." "Quite." She closed the ledger with a firmness that treated the past as a solvent. "You will say, Inspector, that it is not our business to wonder at generosity." "I shall be happy," he said, "to say that our business is to wonder well." She smiled, as if granting him permission to continue being himself. He asked after the pillar box at the corner. "Did it complain?" "It did occasionally of damp. Its aperture had strong views on postcards. The anonymous letters had sometimes come through it, judging by the hour of the first franc, and sometimes by hand. The postmistress's tell-tale, a proprietary knowledge she did not admit publicly, was a faint indentation on the envelope where the human grip had steadied the paper. Here, she pressed a finger upon an invisible spot, just so. One can feel when a letter has been carried with regard rather than haste. "Ring?" asked Purbright. Casual. "Number." The skin made the pressure. A ring would leave its own advertisement. He walked along the counter to the little side window where money orders were dealt with. On the sill lay a blotting pad that had survived several stationers and would, he thought, survive a few more. Impressions remained, ghost sums and names faintly legible under the right contempt of light. He bent, as a man does when the floor has said something. "May one?" he asked. "By all means," said Miss Ferry, whose manners did not permit curiosity to look like denial. The pad retained the shadow of a form completed earlier, a postal order for 5 guineas. The beneficiary was Parish Roof Fund, the handwriting those same forward-leaning loops. The date belonged to the morning of the entry that had begun the town's new hobby of gratitude. "Paid in cash?" he asked. "Always," she said. "People who think of money in guineas are never intimate with cards." He straightened. "You have an admirable memory, Miss Ferry. It is almost geographical." "I keep track of where things think they are," she said. "One cannot deliver otherwise." Mr. Pallister arrived at that moment, as if summoned by the thread of his name through the air. He was tall in the way widowers sometimes are, as though height had been left to him with the house, and his face had the clean absence of a man who has not been disciplined by anecdotes. He removed his cap, with a consideration that did not call attention to itself. "Bag, Miss Ferry?" "Indeed, Mr. Pallister. 11:15. The council will be pleased to see punctuality in something." She offered him the pouch, which he accepted with the practiced care of one who carries other people's conclusions. "Good morning, Inspector," he added, almost as an afterthought to his own presence. "Mr. Pallister," said Purbright, "you are a friend to the town." "I walk," said Pallister, speaking as if sentences were steps. "It prevents trouble." Purbright watched him leave with the bag at his side, the strap not cutting into his coat because straps seldom trouble people who do not expect them to. When the door closed, the bell performed its duty without fuss. Miss Ferry resumed her post, aligning a heap of change that had considered rebellion and thought better of it. "Would you say," asked Purbright, "that the writer of our anonymous letters is the same person who pays for these parcels and postal orders?" "I would say," she replied, "that the town is being tidied by a single pair of standards, Inspector. Whether they require one pair of hands is not for me to guess." Outside, Lowminster had chosen a weather that made everything look accurate, rather than appealing. The pavement shone as if the road sweepers had finally decided to win. Across the square, a woman carried a stiff brown paper parcel whose string had been tied as though it were acquainted with plumb lines. She turned toward the church, stopping briefly to adjust the knot with a small, firm push of her forefinger, the kind of push that makes a triangle of whitened skin for a second and then forgets. Purbright borrowed Miss Ferry's pen and wrote, in his small, careful script, a few words on the corner of his visiting card. "Ribbon faded, then new, franc 8.30. Loops on receipts, cash crisp, no inbound." He returned the pen with thanks of a type that refused to leave a mark. "You will tell me if there is anything I ought to be told," said Miss Ferry, who preferred obligations written down, even when they were merely spoken. "I shall try to tell you before it becomes anything else," he said. "It saves embarrassment, the trouble of growing up." At the door he stopped. On the notice board, among flyers for jumble sales and appeals for volunteers with clean handwriting, a small card had been pinned, a supply list for the Women's Institute, typed in the old style. The commas were pressed, the margins had been coaxed into exactness. At the foot of the card, a handwritten note, only 2 words, had been added in the generous loops of the ledger, as discussed. It is possible that nothing important can be deduced from 2 words in the right hand at the right moment. It is also possible that everything one needs begins precisely there. Purbright looked at the card for the length of time required by a kettle between decision and boil. Then he went out, studying and passing the pillar box at the corner. A faint smear, hardly a color at all, lingered near the slot. Furniture polish, the sober scent of drawers where paper lives. He did not write that down. He preferred, for the present, to let the town's neat arrangements keep their dignity. But as he walked towards Bunton's, he held in mind the map Miss Ferry had drawn without drawing. Mornings at 8:30, envelopes carried with regard, ribbons fading and then faithful again. A hand that improved others as if that were a responsibility. Somewhere between the tidy hour and the generous loops, a house had found the convenience of no address. The question was not where it was exactly, but who had taught it where not to be. The Women's Institute met in the church hall with that industrious quiet which belongs to serious kitchens and conscientious revolutions. The urn on the trestle table emitted a sigh that suggested martyrdom without insisting upon it. Steam made a small cathedral above the spout, and then thought better of architecture. Cups stood in rows, platooned by saucers. A plate of biscuits considered the future in a responsible way. Mrs. Dearden, the president, had arranged herself in the minutes at the top of the room where authority enjoys the company of draughts. She was a woman of shapely standards and careful clothes, the sort who aligns the edge of a document with the edge of a table as a moral exercise. On either side of her, a pair of junior officers maintained expressions which had been, over years, taught to defer. The younger members, girls for whom the century had offered opinions with the relish of a salesman, sat toward the back and held themselves in that posture of obedient suspense, characteristic of people waiting to be improved. Inspector Purbright, invited to attend on the grounds that the police and the Institute serve the same tea, took a chair at the end of the front row. He placed his hat beneath it because hats, in Lowminster, were expected to lower their eyes when ladies spoke. "Ladies," began Mrs. Dearden, turning the first page of minutes with the respectful distaste of a person who dislikes fingerprints. "We shall have the record, which, although lengthy, is, I am persuaded, proportionate to circumstance." She read. The minutes, startling in extent, placed on paper the history of tablecloths as one might set the early chapters of a dynasty. Hem-stitching had been tested and found unequal to the pressure of elderberry. The new cloths, white as a curate's timetable, were to be stored flat, folded with conscious virtue, and, on no account, lent outside institute purposes unless propriety insisted. The kettle, the urn, in deference to its self-esteem, had produced a noise last Thursday which, though not obscene, had merited rebuke. This, together with a subsequent sulk, had led to the present assembly's first item, a new kettle, considerations and consequences. "We must," said Mrs. Dearden, "bequeath to posterity a kitchen equal to its obligations." From the back, a younger voice, Miss Trent, who concealed sense under a fringe, ventured that boiling water rarely improved by biography. She was suppressed by a glance that had been perfected gradually and could, if necessary, extinguish the flame under a pan at 20 paces. "So," resumed Mrs. Dearden, satisfied that resistance had been made safe for history, "to donations. We are in receipt," she invested the phrase with silver, "of a benefaction, anonymous, yet of a nature one might call." She allowed herself the smallest pause. Thoughtful. "It is from house with no address. The sum has enabled us to acquire better cutlery and to consider, in a more substantial way, stricter propriety. Relief and alarm distributed themselves with admirable fairness. The younger ladies were heartened by the prospect of knives that did not behave like souvenirs. They were less pleased by any program which matched cutlery with conscience. In the second row, Mrs. Pye murmured approval into a handkerchief that had been ironed into reason. Inspector Purbright lifted his eyes in the polite manner of a man about to admit curiosity to a social gathering. "A handsome gift," he said. "May I ask who handles the Institute's correspondence?" "We alternate," said Mrs. Dearden promptly, as if rescuing principle from the suggestion of personality. "So that no one person becomes indispensable. It leads to mannerisms." "Quite," said Purbright. "Mannerisms can be contagious." "They breed," said Mrs. Dearden with precision. "One begins with a flourish and ends with a doctrine." She closed the minute book, large, leathered, and convinced, then opened a side cupboard from which she produced a cardboard box, lid neatly labelled in a sensible hand. "Letters. We retain correspondence," she explained, for the avoidance of repetition and the encouragement of gratitude. "Inspector, if you would be so good." He was, of course, so good. He carried the box to a table near the urn, which sighed again, having misread its role as tragic. Inside the box, envelopes had been kept like mementos of small admonitions. Their flaps wore tidy creases. Their stamps sat square and modest. Their paper, even when common, had acquired a seriousness from association. "Here," said Mrs. Dearden, selecting with an accuracy that cannot be taught, "our friend the house. We have had 3 communications, one enclosing a note toward cutlery, one suggesting that our notices might employ fewer exclamation marks, one, this last, commenting upon the skirt length at last month's craft stall and recommending the repair of youth by example." The envelopes bore typing of the old style, justified margins, commas pressed firmly as if pauses required supervision and not a smudge of correction. 2 carried the faint scent of lavender, wardrobes rather than fields. The 3rd had about it a suggestion of furniture polish and old drawers, the sober aroma of rooms that keep their opinions dusted. "Lavender," said Purbright, half to himself. "Prudence has a smell," said Mrs. Dearden. "We should be grateful." He slid a forefinger along a flap without tearing, a party trick learned in a previous existence when paper had been less plentiful than secrets. The paper inside was watermarked, Eversley Bond, £22, a stock the town had chosen as a compromise between economy and self-respect. In each, the phraseology exhibited a love of rectitude dressed as kindness. "It would be a comfort," one sentence began, "if the young could be persuaded that gratitude is not a posture but a posture's correction." "Who writes the minutes?" he asked, replacing the sheet with the casual care of a man who never rearranged other people. "We alternate," said Mrs. Dearden again, but modulation made it new. "I take the notes. Occasionally Miss Orme, at the organ, makes a fair copy if the matter is to be published. If the topic is educational, Dr. Tolland assists in the wording on grounds of syntax." "Thus," said Purbright, "propriety benefits from collaboration." "We believe in sharing burdens," she said in a tone that would have crucified a shirk. He examined a bundle of newsletters kept with a treasury tag that had been persuaded to lie flat. The Institute's Civic Notices column, small, rectangular, and intense, carried 2 appeals which he had already met elsewhere, shyly translated, "Maintain standards. Assistance appreciated." The commas, he noticed, were pressed with the same insistence he had found on the council letter and in the vicarage envelope, a habit more than a fingerprint, but a habit nonetheless. From the back of the room came the quiet percussion of a quarrel being enacted as domestic ritual. Miss Trent, her courage on a string, observed that stricter propriety ought to be explained in terms of inches rather than size. Mrs. Hatch, who had been married long enough to prefer principles to measurements, replied that an instinct for decency could not be worn with a tape. Another young woman, Miss Doyle, who organized books and boys with equal suspicion, asked whether the anonymous donor could be induced to add better heating to the list, as standards grew brittle in a draft. "We cannot," said Mrs. Dearden, "direct a benefactor. Kindness ought to be faceless." Purbright wondered, privately, why kindness so often borrowed the face of authority. He allowed the thought to sit among others in that quiet place inside him where worldly hypotheses live on good behavior. "May I?" He gestured to the typewriter on the side table, a portable that had been covered with a cloth in the hope that it would behave. Its ribbon looked new enough to be vain. A sheet half rolled into the carriage presented the heading for the next newsletter: Women's Institute. Notices. He tapped the comma key thoughtfully and found the machine returning a character that landed with an assurance uncommon among punctuation. The key had been pressed often and with personality. "Does everyone use this machine?" he asked. "Those who must," said Mrs. Dearden. We keep it here so that nothing in the house is overburdened. Miss Orme will sometimes bring a cleaner ribbon. She cannot bear fading sentences." "A rare piety," said Purbright. "It saves the eye," she replied, "and therefore the soul." Miss Pye rose from the second row to remind the president, with great courtesy, that there remained the question of ham sandwiches at after-service teas. She felt they encouraged irreligious contentment. The room hesitated, as if asked to choose between hunger and heaven. The urn, opting for neutrality, breathed. "I am not persuaded," said Mrs. Dearden, "that food is in itself a seduction, but it ought to be on plates that do not apply to be forgotten." "It is the combination that alarms," said Miss Pye. "Ham and opinions." The younger women admired this, though not loyally. A compromise was drafted: ham to be offered under a cloth, opinions to be taken away, wrapped. Purbright wandered in the way of men who were actually attentive to a corkboard near the hatch. There, under a notice about raffles, a supply list had been pinned. Teaspoons, dozen, cloth for urn handle, asbestos substitute, labels for jars, strong gum, and a line, added by hand in generous loops, as discussed. The loops leaned forward like people who mean well. He had seen them that morning in the post office ledger, the same kindly remonstrance concealed beneath tidiness. "Who writes the lists?" he asked, indicating the curl of ink. "We share that too," said Mrs. Dearden. "But Mrs. Cleeve often contributes. She has a love of paper that is practically devotional." "Does she bring envelopes?" "She brings order," said Mrs. Dearden, which in Lowminster furnished envelopes as a matter of course. A kettle debate recommenced with the dignity reserved for marriages and masonry. The old urn had, after all, survived fates, harvests, and that Christmas when the electricity had gone out, and everyone had been warmed by their ethics. Was a new one necessary, or merely modern? Miss Trent pressed for a spout that did not threaten wrists. Mrs. Hatch observed that risk sharpened character. A compromise was fashioned in which a new kettle would be trialed, but the urn retained for ritual suffering. "Inspector," said Mrs. Dearden, with that deference people show to someone they do not wish to contradict, "it might ease our minds to know whether these anonymous benefactions fall within your purview. We would dislike to collaborate with Vice." "Vice rarely writes so neatly," said Purbright, "and it seldom remembers to spell institute correctly. I should be content for you to accept cutlery on trust." "Propriety?" asked a girl in the back. "That," said Purbright, smiling without movement, "is generally a local manufacture." There was tea. It came in a stream obedient to the law of gravity. Milk followed with resignation. Conversation moderated to the murmur of people compensating for conversation. Purbright accepted a cup and placed it on the edge of a table where many decisions had cooled. As he did so, his sleeve brushed the cardboard letters box. The lid slid, the lightest inch, and revealed beneath the top layer of envelopes a sliver of black. Old carbon paper, cut to a narrow strip, the kind used to produce duplicates where duplicates are not an admission, but a courtesy. He looked at it without touching, as one looks at a sleeping animal one may later have to wake. On the corner of the strip a small triangular nick showed, not the accidental raggedness of cheap stationery, but the definite bite of a paper knife long used in the same hand. He had seen that triangle before, in the faint dent on envelopes from the house, at the vicarage and at the council, where a ringless finger braced paper in exactly that place, and in the council clerk's file when she closed prongs over letters with a motion practiced enough to become a notch upon the day. "Everything all right, Inspector?" asked Mrs. Dearden, who believed even silence should be supervised. "Entirely," he said, replacing the lid by not replacing it. "May I borrow for a day the most recent anonymous letter? I will ensure its good behavior and your convenience." "If the town is improved by its absence," she replied, "we can spare it for an afternoon." He took the envelope in a pocket where receipts found themselves ennobled. The urn sighed once more, rebuked by its replacement's bright chrome lifespan. Someone at the back laughed, the short kind of laugh that means agreement has been deposited. On the trestle, teaspoons, newly bought and slightly ashamed of it, chimed against a bowl. At the door he paused. The draft caught a pinned newsletter and lifted it by an inch. The page displayed a line, "We are resolved to maintain standards," set in the precise, justified style that had begun to feel like a conversation spoken in several rooms at once. Beneath in graphite, the faintest erasure clouded the paper where a comma had been repositioned. Only a person who had pressed it too hard would leave a ghost in that particular crescent. He stepped out into Lowminster's afternoon, which had settled into a kind of good behavior the sky can manage when it takes instruction from roofs. In his pocket, the envelope lay entirely proper, as if propriety could be folded. He did not yet formalize the thought that had tapped him on the shoulder, about the nick in the carbon, the heavy commas, the language that traveled from group to group like a borrowed hymn, but its presence altered the air he moved through. There are moments, even in towns that dislike moments, when tidiness reveals a seam. He walked back toward the square at a pace that guaranteed he was not hurrying. Somewhere behind him, the urn gave up and boiled. Ahead, the pillar box stood with its slit composed. He found himself entertaining, not as certainty but as civil suspicion, the possibility that kindness, having recommended facelessness, had taken care to borrow only the most respectable faces. Blegg and Rowbotham, solicitors, had the sort of carpet that absorbs both footsteps and confidences with equal competence. It was not new. It was correct. Along the corridor, deed boxes dozed under painted labels, and a grandfather clock performed constancy not as music but as posture. Brass nameplates on office doors had been polished past vanity and into creed. The air, faintly respectful of furniture polish, suggested that truth, if it were to enter, would be expected to wipe its shoes. Inspector Purbright was shown into Mr. Rowbotham's room by a clerk who possessed the singular talent of being audible only to furniture. She indicated a chair with a kind of gesture that reminded one to be grateful for joints. The chair complied with law office tradition by acknowledging a sitter without ever promising comfort. Mr. Rowbotham arrived with the unhurried gravity of a man to whom punctuality presents itself rather than the other way round. He had arranged his hair and his conclusions with method. His spectacles were the plain sort worn by people who have come to terms with seeing. On the desk before him, two piles of paper confronted one another in a manner that implied litigation might break out at any moment and be settled by the clock. "Inspector," he said, as if greeting both a visitor and a proposition, "Lowminster is fortunate. We do not often require you. When we do, we try to be reasonable." "I rely on that," Purbright said. His voice revealed neither reliance nor its absence. They exchanged pleasantries of the species that feigns small talk and practices reconnaissance. Mr. Rowbotham asked after the police budget in the tone of a man inquiring whether the weather had been taught its place. Purbright returned the civility by praising the firm's punctuality in sending probate notices that could be read without offense. The ground thus irrigated, the inspector mentioned the late Alderman Cleeve and the trust whose shadow had lately felt companionable. Mr. Rowbotham was not a man to be startled by names he had helped to spell. "Ah," he said, drawing a paper to him with the calm authority of a registrar. "The Cleeve Endowment for Civic Improvement, a modest instrument with an ambitious temper. Established," he consulted a date as if rewarding it, "some years ago, and confirmed by codicil when the alderman determined to be as generous in leaving as he had been industrious in staying." "Purpose?" asked Purbright. "To improve the tone and fabric of local institutions that might otherwise be tempted by informality," said Rowbotham with an air of quoting something that had never forgiven itself for feeling. It was the alderman's view that standards are like hedges. You don't grow them by compliment. The trust permits grants, small, regular, and without public display, toward items and arrangements that keep Lowminster recognizable to itself. Correspondence? Purbright let the word find its place on the desk. Handled discreetly. Robotham placed his finger upon a clause and turned it for sunlight. You will observe the phrase, by such honorary secretary or agent as the trustees shall from time to time appoint. Discretion, Inspector, is legally neutral, though socially rather busy. We stipulate it not to conceal irregularity, but to avoid flattering it into being. Quite, said Purbright. Neutrality is a quality the town admires at a distance. Distance, said Robotham, is the only position from which admiration remains tidy. He went on. The alderman's widow had, in the early period, served as correspondent for acknowledgements and small notes addressed to committees. A formidable woman, he said, and made the word sound like a commendation with footnotes. Her sense of ceremony extends to commas. In those days, he glanced toward a typewriter on a side table, covered decently against drafts. We had a girl to help copy minutes, circa 1974, when adding machines believed themselves clever. She typed in the office style. I noticed that certain recent letters, purely as a private observation, resemble that manner in their justification and their punctuation's firmness. Recent letters, said Purbright, addressing themselves to propriety by way of anonymity. Your description is arresting, said Robotham. I will only say that standards, if they are to travel safely through a town, often travel veiled. It prevents them being kissed by the wrong people. Your trust, Purbright said, does not sponsor letters? It sponsors improvements, said Robotham, and allowed the words to rest with the weight of a rule's exception. Whether a committee uses attention along the way is a matter for the committee. Our concern is that invoices be honorable. The town is too small for dishonor to be practical. Miss Verity Orme, said Purbright, as if placing a bookmark for later. She is mentioned as an occasional helper. The solicitor's face acquired the gentlest harness. Miss Orme, he said, a person of practicality and, I should add, of scruple. The organ keeps her honest. Typing keeps the organ in tune. She has, from time to time, assisted parish groups to render minutes into legibility and legibility into decency. He lowered his eyes to the trust document in order that what he was not saying might have company. She is not employed by Mrs. Cleeve. She is employed by correctness, which is low paid, said Purbright. Ah, said Robotham, but generational. The room maintained its charity for detail. On the mantel, a framed photograph of the firm's founders made the sort of claim ancestors make when the members of a family begin to adopt opinions. On a chair by the window, a stiff-backed file stamped with a blue label, Acknowledgements Discreet, leaned like a person pretending to rest. The typewriter's cover had been folded back by an arm that understood minimalism. The machine beneath was a portable from the era when manufacturers believed the future would be punctual. On its carriage, a sheet of carbon, narrow cut to shape, peeped in the way secrets practice. Your office style, Mr. Robotham, said Purbright, ambling in the direction of irrelevance, has its admirers. We prefer to be only admired at the bank, said Robotham, but the corner of his mouth confessed he liked the observation. Still, the old forms are serviceable. We instruct our juniors that margins are moral, and commas are pauses in which one might reconsider a slander. Who instructs the town? Asked Purbright very mildly. Time, said Robotham, and Mrs. Cleeve. He rang a bell which tinkled in a soundproof sort of way, and the clerk appeared with the precise degree of alacrity the room could sustain. Miss Dale, he said, be so kind as to bring the public summary of the Cleeve endowment. Yes, the laminated version. The police admire lamination. And the list of recent grants. No signatures. Miss Dale had the anonymous features of competence. She departed and returned with papers that had never permitted themselves to curl. Purbright accepted the summary, which had been written with the caution of a person who believes nouns ought to be insured. "Your grants," he said, scanning the list the way a botanist might consult a hedge. "Accessions for the library, tablecloths for the institute, stationery for proper acknowledgements, a modest contribution to a kettle that wished to be a lifetime, are surprisingly literary." "It is easier," said Rowbotham, "to improve grammar than character. One hopes virtue will discover it has been improved while looking the other way." "And the correspondence?" He received the smallest, most decorous of shrugs. "Drafts circulated where drafts find companionship. I've often seen a sentence seek its true owner across several committees and come to rest in a newsletter. Ownership is a philosophical category the law keeps for last." Miss Dale withdrew as softly as she had come, but not before she had set down, with that sensible negligence shared by superior clerks, a pile of carbons cut into strips. They were the old, shiny black, corresponding to a generation that preferred imitations to admissions. On the top one, at the right-hand corner, a triangular notch had been snipped cleanly, exactly the little bite that Purbright had come to recognize as a habit grown sharp, the paper knife's measure, the left forefinger's guide, the tiny geometry of long practice. He did not point, he did not touch. He contented himself with the respect of noticing. "There is," said Rowbotham, "if you will permit it, a remark I might add. The town, being habit-forming, formed the habit of Alderman Cleeve. He believed, as many who have survived committees do, that decency requires a front door which is often closed. He imagined the trust as a hallway. One puts items there which it would be indelicate to carry the length of the drawing-room. Anonymous benefactions," said Purbright, "are admirable on the page. In practice, they always seem to require a neighbour." "Quite. The neighbours require instruction. It is not the business of this office to teach courtesy, Inspector. We merely insist that it reach its destination without suing anyone." "An ideal," said Purbright, considering the polished letter knife beside the blotter. Its blade showed shallow scars. The handle, bone, quietly old, had been used to crease envelopes along the same neat line until a small nick had bitten a permanent shape in the corner. "Do you happen to remember the girl who typed minutes in 1974? "She married and left," said Rowbotham, as if announcing a necessary migration. "We missed her accuracy, but got over it. Her replacements learnt quickly where to put a pause." "And Mrs. Cleeve?" "A widow with a theology of civic order," he said, so equably that affection could be mistaken for neutrality. "She no longer employs anyone. She has, instead, the town." Silence arrived with good breeding and took up only the space required. Through the window the square looked innocent of plots. Somewhere a lorry reversed politely. Rowbotham permitted his fingers to flatten the edge of the summary, a solicitor's manner of showing that the conversation had entered its epilogue. "You are welcome," he said, "to keep the public summary. It has been useful to the devout and to those who prefer not to be. I will add, as a personal observation rather than a professional one, that the endowment has improved the town's ability to spell. This alone is a civic achievement. It warns vice that it must at least be literate." Purbright slipped the laminated sheet into his case as if he were entering into a private agreement with plastic. "Your assistance is valued," he said. "I imagine you will understand if I ask as a matter of routine to look in upon Miss Orme." "She is often in the church at odd hours," said Rowbotham, practicing scales as if they were morals. "Failing that, you will find her cottage tuned to Bach and respectability." "And the letters?" "The law," said Rowbotham, "does not presently recognize houses that refuse addresses, but it admits that some addresses have more house than others." He smiled, thereby providing the room with a precedent for mildness. "If you find you require anything more exact than that, Inspector, write to me. I should hate to be obliged to explain this conversation to the future by guesswork." They stood. The clerk reappeared as if summoned by the creak of leather. She collected the carbons, aligning them with the edge of the desk until the notch made a neat little chevron against the pile. In the corridor, as Purbright followed her toward the door that had been instructed to behave like oak, he heard, from an inner room, the discreet tap of a typewriter making a comma. It landed with conviction, as if aware that pauses have standards. At the threshold, he paused long enough to look back into the office. The letter knife lay diagonally across the blotter. Beneath it, caught like a leaf under ice, was a memorandum slip. The pencil note, in a generous, forward-leaning hand he had begun to recognize, read, "As discussed, thank you notes to be sent, no names." The loops strode forward with their usual tact. A faint dusting of eraser crumbs clung to the edge, where the word "sincerely" had been corrected to "properly." He shut the door upon the odor of polish and the habit of commas. On the pavement outside, Lowminster presented its mid-afternoon face. Not peaceful exactly, but engaged in the organization of harmlessness. Across the way, Bunton's stationer had set a display of ribbon tins in the window, black only, pyramided with a sense of moral architecture. The tins reflected the sky with a restraint the sky could not match. Purbright stood a moment and allowed his thoughts the sort of courtesy he never extended to suspects. Mrs. Cleeve, a trust with a hallway for improvements, letters whose style believed manners could be posted, a typewriter that remembered 1974 more fondly than 1974 deserved, carbons nicked to suit a forefinger, a clerk who placed "as discussed" where people might read it as conscience. He did not decide. He made instead a small inventory under his breath, as a tailor might murmur measurements: Eversley stock, heavy commas, lavender that has chosen drawers over fields, triangular notch again. These together were not meaning yet. They were the softened edge of something that would be a meaning when pushed. He turned toward the church where, if the organ was being argued into temperance, Miss Verity Orme would be patiently victorious. The trust's summary touched his side through the case, cool and content. Behind him, in the firm that did not tell lies so much as keep truth to its timetable, a comma landed once more, thoughtful and firm, and then another. It was not a sound that would trouble most ears. He found that it troubled his, in the civically useful sense, and wondered, with the kind of politeness he reserved for particularly tidy puzzles, whether the town's standards had learnt to travel veiled in order to arrive, or whether the veil had found it inconvenient not to travel. Miss Verity Orme's cottage had organized itself along lines which, if consulted, would have recommended her as a public amenity. The small parlor at the front offered a piano whose lid had learned to close with moral tact. On top of it, a metronome stood like an upright citizen. Along one wall, a bookcase held music and modest theology in equal, alternating ranks. The kitchen beyond, visible through a doorway that had been persuaded never to betray smells, displayed labeled tins, flour, sugar, tea, written in a hand that did not so much form letters as correct them. By the window, a typewriter sat covered against drafts of both air and impropriety. The cover itself, cotton, had been hemmed as though it might someday apply to be a napkin. Inspector Purbright, admitted at the hour when daylight becomes neighborly, removed his hat in the manner encouraged by door lintels designed before height acquired self-esteem. Miss Orme met him with a degree of welcome consistent with good upbringing and cautious mayonnaise. She was in her 30s, tidy without apology, with a face that had settled upon fairness rather than charm and would defend it. Her hands were pianist's hands in retirement, the fingers long but not sentimental. "You are kind to come," she said. "I am practicing honesty this afternoon and thought it would benefit from an audience." "Honesty," said Purbright, "improves with company until it begins to perform." She accepted this and gestured him toward the piano. "Bach," she said, opening the lid with the economy of someone who had decided many times not to bang it. He understands about conversation. One plays a line and it behaves for the sake of the others. She gave him 2 pages of a prelude, each line obedient to the rhythm of a life that left most feelings to the bass. It was neither showpiece nor penitence. It occupied the room the way a competent person does, without troubling furniture. When she had concluded, she placed her hands flat upon her knees and turned, as if that were what music meant by a bow. "I am told," she said, "you have become interested in envelopes." "In what they persuade people to do," said Purbright, "and what people persuade them to smell of." She smiled, which improved nothing and therefore satisfied her. Tea. She poured it in a style that spared one the embarrassment of refusing. The cups, thin, carried the sort of floral pattern that had not yet forgiven the century for changing its colors. "Yes," she said, before he asked, "I sometimes type church notices. Yes, I once typed acknowledgments of bequests for Mrs. Cleeve when the alderman died. No, I've never heard of a house that refuses to be addressed. It would be homeless on principle, which seems theatrical." "I am content," said Purbright, "with your theatre, if you are." They drank. The tea behaved exactly. He allowed his gaze to drift to the arty typewriter in its well-tailored modesty. "May I look?" he asked. "By all means," she said. "It is not on duty today." He lifted the cover as one lifts a veil in a painting. The machine beneath was the respectable sort, portable but not jaunty, with a carriage that had always taken itself seriously. The ribbon, he noted, was new. Too new. Letters struck on the test line. He set down a shy ASDF for the left hand and a deferential LKJ for the right, landed with a crisp black confidence. The comma key, when pressed, supplied a pause that knew its worth. "You change ribbons often," he observed. "Regularly," said Miss Orme. "Words ought not to arrive faded. It discourages meaning." Purbright ran a finger, not touching, merely indicating, along the margin. The justification bar had the faint sheen of a part used by someone who respected straightness. Beneath the table, where carbon paper sometimes went to sulk, lay a narrow strip, neatly cut and still glossy, with a small triangular snip at the corner, identical to the nick he had seen in the solicitor's carbons and, more gently, in the dents of certain envelopes. "That is for minutes," she said, following his glance. "If something has to be copied, I prefer to leave the original at peace." "Peace," said Purbright, "is what documents are most often at when they are least examined." She allowed that it might be so. "You assisted the alderman's widow?" he asked, returning to his tea lest interest be mistaken for hunger. "After his death," said Miss Orme, "there was a quantity of gratitude that needed typing. The letters were not extravagant. The aldermen preferred modest receipts. Mrs. Cleeve thought a town should be taught to say thank you properly, even if it only felt it later. She no longer employs help. She supervises without employing. It is efficient, said Miss Orme, without malice. People here have been taught how to be useful without asking for remuneration. It is one of our minor shames. Your work at the church. Voluntary, she said. The organ does not pay, but it makes the air behave. He asked, almost idly, whether she sometimes wrote notices for the Women's Institute. If they ask, she said, and if the commas have mislaid themselves. One cannot preserve standards without a pencil. They sat a while in a civility that would have suited an earlier century. Outside, a cart went past at the dignified speed of someone who has counted his steps for decades. The cottage held the faint scent of soap and a ghost of lavender. Drawers, not fields. On the mantel, a photograph of a choir under tasteful lighting confirmed that someone had once sung for reasons that could be said aloud. I hope, she said, after the pause had reached its correct length, you will tell me whether I am a suspect. It would be a pity to practice wrong music out of mere ignorance. Not a suspect, said Purbright, an exemplar, which is worse, but unpunishable. At least until the festival, she said, with a turn that suggested appetite could be educated into humor. The doorbell, a modest ring chosen for its obliging timbre, announced someone who would, in all likelihood, accept a refusal with dignity. Miss Orme stood. She smoothed her skirt as if the bell were critical. "At this hour," she said, "only the florist or the prudent errand boy arrives." It was the florist, carrying a bouquet whose colors had been taught to get along. He stood on the step in that attitude of honest men who have come to like scent against better judgment. "Delivered with compliments," he said, and extended the blooms. Stocks and lilies for respectability, a sprig of rosemary to remind the water jug of its obligations. A small card rode among them. Miss Orme took the bouquet with the sober gratitude of one who knows flowers behave better if met halfway. She opened the card and read. Purbright watched her face acquire that careful blankness people develop when they have been surprised in their own home and wish to deny it to the furniture. "With thanks, house with no address," she read aloud, as if reading to someone with whom she preferred to be honest. "Kind," said the inspector. "Unhelpful," said Miss Orme. "Someone is teasing." The florist, perhaps tired of bells, produced his invoice. "Paid in advance by Mrs. Imogen Cleeve," he said, "because people in possession of facts believe facts have a right to be heard." He pointed with an ethical finger to a note at the bottom, "Deliver discreetly," written in the generous loops Purbright had begun to recognize like a private road. "Please thank Mrs. Cleeve for her forethought," said Miss Orme, finding the word after examining two others, "and advise her, if advising is included in the price, that jokes about anonymity amuse nobody except anonymity." When the door had closed, she set the flowers on the piano. They lent it a refinement it might have thought superfluous. "Mrs. Cleeve is liberal with other people's blushes," she said. "It is a habit in those who have few of their own left." "She is generous," said Purbright, which in Lowminster could be accusation or defense depending upon the angle of the sun. Miss Orme looked at him as if he had asked for a particular note in a piece she did not care to play. "Do you—" she began, and found herself unwilling to be recorded even by a room. "Do you suppose the house is hers?" "I suppose," said Purbright, "that houses with windows get used to seeing people pass by, and that some people prefer the curtain to be drawn when they are performing public spirit. Mrs. Cleeve's intention may be to save everyone time by agreeing with them in advance. She would prefer a town that already knows how to be grateful," said Miss Orme. "I think we have discovered that gratitude cannot be posted to people without addresses. It tends to return soured." They returned to the parlor. The bouquet, having been placed, gave off a mild aroma of good behavior mingled with something older, the polish of drawers and the authority of clean linen. On the piano stool the inspector noticed a shallow dusting of eraser crumbs, the timid remains of a correction. On the music rack beneath the buck, a folded sheet of church notices peeped out, "Thanks are due. Proper acknowledgments to follow." The comma in the parenthesis had been pressed into the paper like a moral. One could feel it with a fingertip. "You receive letters from the house?" he asked gently. "No," she smiled without comfort. "I receive people who have received letters from the house. They arrive looking a little improved and a little older." "You typed for the Women's Institute this week," he said, as if remembering where he had left a pen. "I corrected 2 commas and rehabilitated a verb," she said. "If this be guilt, Inspector, I hope to repeat it." "And for the council?" "The clerk does not enjoy charity," she said. "She prefers marches to kindness. I leave her undisturbed." "Mr. Robotham suggested," he ventured, "that your office style, circa 1974, has had a long afterlife." "It was a good year for margins," she said. "We believed straightness could be taught." A clock somewhere declared the hour in a tone that wished to be thought modest. Miss Orme rose, went to the typewriter, and replaced its cover with the conscientiousness kept for children at bedtime. "Inspector," she said, "you must suppose me critical of the house." "I am not. I am critical of the town's readiness to be improved without having to say so out loud. There is an economy of virtue in Lowminster. It spends itself by proxy." He did not contradict her. The bouquet occupied the room like a principled guest. Propriety had been made visible and requested to smell nice. "Do you know," she added, as if deciding to be kind to both of them, "why Buck is so agreeable to committees? He is full of separate lines. Each believes itself independent, yet without the others. It sounds like self-regard." "A lesson," said Purbright, "that travels." They went to the door. He thanked her for the music and the tea and for the unspent courtesy in both. She returned to the piano as if to reassure it of its function. At the threshold, he paused over a small object on the hall table, a bone-handled letter knife. Along one edge, he saw, lay the faintest notch, triangular, where the blade had met the corner of too many envelopes and taught it how to be. "It keeps envelopes from straying," she said. "One owes stationery a certain loyalty." "Quite," said Purbright. "The town owes it as well." He let himself out. The lane offered the sort of weather one produces for neighbors, sufficient to see by, uninteresting, to complain about. He walked without hurrying. In his pocket, the florist's carbon copy of the invoice, obtained with a word and an opinion about receipts, moved just enough to remind him of its loops and its "deliver discreetly." At the end of the lane, the churchyard admitted him to the pleasure of upright stones. He stopped under a yew that had outlived its own hobby of gloom and considered, not for the first time, what the town would look like if names were printed on behaviors. Somewhere behind him, a piano began, Bach again, and found, in the old orderliness, an energy that did not shout. The flowers had been sent from a widow who believed standards travelled better veiled. The ribbon on Miss Orme's machine was new enough to certify innocence. Yet the nick in her carbon neatly matched to the notch in her letter knife, the pressed commas in the notice beneath the buck, the faint smell of drawers in a bouquet allegedly addressless, and a card that managed to be both coy and legible. These found one another in his mind and exchanged the time of day. He did not call it conclusion. He allowed it, like an entry in a ledger written before someone thought to total the column, to remain a hint. And as he turned toward the square, he wondered, a question he did not mind carrying a little, who in Lowminster had first taught the town to play Bach as if each line were a separate conscience, and whether the hand that pressed commas also decided when to lift a finger from a key. Lowminster Library greeted callers with a temperate civility as if books would forgive anyone who entered slowly. Its doorway had been measured by serious men to ensure that enthusiasm could not rush, and its mat, woven out of the town's sense of occasion, invited souls to behave. Beyond a glass panel frosted into frosty good manners, the lending desk waited in the position of a vicar politely refusing applause. The room had the particular silence of institutions that never quarrel, only annotate. Miss Blodgett, librarian, presided with the bedside manner of one who believes knowledge is convalescent. She spoke about donors as one might speak of invalids, softly and without sudden movements. Her cardigans had the color of damp leaves and the shape of a doctrine, and her spectacles suspended judgment on a very fine chain. When Inspector Purbright arrived, she looked up as if she had been expecting an appointment at some point in the century and was gratified to find it was now. "We have been bearing gifts," she said, and inclined her head toward a trolley that held a set of etiquette handbooks in the reliable shade of sermon blue. A complete run, correct deportment in the modern age, 1958 to 1972, revised where circumstances warranted and carefully scolded where they did not. "Book plates?" asked Purbright, taking the uppermost volume with a reverent impertinence. "Indeed." She opened to the front fly-leaf. Each bore a printed label, cream, faintly self-approving, onto which had been typed with conscientious deliberation the words, "From a friend, 0 High Street." "0," said Purbright. Miss Blodgett observed the character with the discretion of one handling a dubious relative. "The figure is undecided, Inspector. It faces both ways with equal conviction. I incline to 0, philosophically." "Nothing at a high street," said Purbright, "might be an address Lowminster would recognize." "It has always liked the void when properly labelled," she replied. "We have accessioned them nonetheless. A library, as you know, prefers to be grateful before it becomes suspicious." The accession slips lay beneath the volumes in a fan, signed, as regulations demand, by the receiving authority and, as custom requires, by whoever wished to be thanked later. The donor's name, of course, was withheld by principle. The space for address had been filled, somewhat playfully, by 0 High Street. But the slips also bore, in their margin, a notation of condition and a brief description of subject, both written in the same generous, forward-leaning hand Purbright had studied at the post office ledger, and on invoices that insisted upon propriety. The loops strode forward, letters entering the line as if accustomed to reception. They were the hand of someone who corrected others kindly and often. "The letter that accompanied them?" asked Purbright. Miss Blodgett produced a single sheet from a manila folder on which she had written, with the tidy fatalism of long practice, "Gifts recent." The letter was typed with marked precision. Its margins had been coaxed into agreement. Its commas had a firmness that could be felt rather than seen, as if the typist believed punctuation might mend character if pressed hard enough. The tone maintained a certain amusement at the modern age. The writer suggested that good manners were social punctuation, and that young people, if they would insist on opinions, might at least learn how to place them quietly. "You will see," Miss Blodgett murmured. "The ink is unfaded. This ribbon was changed in an interval untroubled by thrift." Purbright lowered the letter to the desk, ran a fingertip across a paragraph, the way one might over a thumbnail to test for smoothness. Under the lamp his touch found miniature half-moons, indentations where commas had been overstruck. The habit produced a crispness that could be mistaken for charm. It was a learned tidiness. One acquired such assurance when a mentor stood near and approved. "You will also wish," Miss Blodgett added, producing from beneath the pile a small envelope with the useful immodesty of stationery that has already done what it came for, "to admire the address. Lowminster Library. Attention of librarian. Properly. It is rare to find adverbs attached to my office." The envelope was of Eversley stock, £22, watermarked lightly as if reserving its opinions for a better audience. Stamp square. Flap correctly sealed. The faint scent of lavender drawers rather than fields, and, if one placed one's attention to it, a thin whisper of furniture polish. The smell of old wood that had chosen not to decay. "May I see the bookplates again?" asked Purbright. Miss Blodgett acquiesced, turning to the front of Volume 2. Beneath, "From a friend, 0 High Street," a pencil had intervened. Someone had inserted, quite gently and then half erased, the word "the" before High Street. The ghost remained in paler graphite, smudged by the softest use of an eraser. On another plate, a comma had been shifted. "From a friend, 0 High Street" had become, briefly, "From a friend, 0 High Street," before the additional pause was persuaded to vanish. Few people, Purbright thought, bothered to erase themselves so delicately. "We did not perform that operation," said Miss Blodgett, who possessed the librarian's reflex to confess only to cataloguing. "When the volumes arrived, I observed the marginalia at once. There are traces elsewhere." She leafed to the back of one volume. On the index page, a small hand had written in pencil, "See also, Considerations of Silence." The phrase was underlined once, then the line nearly rubbed away, near a chapter entitled on indebtedness and the thank you letter. A neat bracket had been drawn, then swabbed to a ghost. A spectator without training would have missed them. An inspector with training was content to be tutored by absence. Standards, Miss Blodgett murmured, almost piously, require an eraser. Quite, said Purbright. He took up the accompanying letter once more and compared the commas dents with those in his memory from the parish magazine's envelopes and the council's complaint. The habit of overstriking persisted. Commas were not placed. They were installed. The carriage must be adjusted, he thought, or the typist had been trained to insist on pauses with a pressure learned in older rooms. "Your machine?" he asked, nodding toward the small typewriter in the staff alcove. It sat slightly to one side, as if preferring not to intrude upon the authority of binding. "An elderly Remington," said Miss Blodgett. "That is loyal, rather than merry. Our ribbon is admirably worn. We do not overstrike except by accident. Who else types here?" "Only Miss Vale," she said, indicating a young assistant whose expression suggested generous boredom. "And she would rather punch tickets than verbs. The letter, then, typed where?" Miss Blodgett considered the ceiling with the composed speculation of a person who is choosing a book for someone else. "Not here, not Bunton's. His demonstration machine insists on red and black righteousness and cannot be told to be discreet. The council's device is new and a little too pleased with itself. The vicarage, perhaps, though their ribbon, when devoted to sermons, fades like good intentions." "Committee machines," said Purbright. She nodded. "Doctor." Tolland, the school governor, often borrows a typewriter for committee matters. He brings it back with gratitude and a suspicion that gratitude has been wasted on the undeserving. He's an old-fashioned man. You may have met his punctuation in the parish magazine. It calls attention to itself with the humility of a curate. "Where does he borrow it from?" "Anywhere that will not ask him why," said Miss Blodgett with a tolerance that had outlived several headmasters. "Sometimes from the library, though he disapproves of fiction with a zeal that weakens his judgment. More often, I think, from the church office when Miss Orme is not using it. Occasionally from the meeting room at Blegg and Rowbotham, who maintain, as you know, a benevolent view of tidiness." "Does he return it?" "With gratitude," she repeated, "and a fresh ribbon installed, so that everyone may admire his scruples." Purbright's glance drifted across the counter to the borrower's ledger, which Miss Blodgett slid forward without being asked. Names had been written, dates applied, the odd fine recorded with a moral that people still responded to. Against each borrowing of the etiquette series, a note had been penciled. "Staff copy, in-house use." The hand that had written it was large and looped, and it leaned forward more from persuasion than gravity. "Who wrote these?" he asked. "I did," said Miss Blodgett, and then, perhaps unwilling to be praised, added, "and at times Mrs. Cleeve has reminded me to add, as discussed." She believes lists acquire dignity by remembering they were conversations first. "Mrs. Cleeve arranged the gift?" "She arranged the gift to arrange itself," said Miss Blodgett. "The friend at 0 High Street needed only the suggestion." "And the friend is anonymous," she said softly, as if protecting the anonymity from drafts. "A habit is not a person, Inspector. Lowminster has many habits. It likes to call them friends." Purbright returned the etiquette volume to the trolley and tried a sentence at random. If gratitude is to be expressed in writing, it should be as brief as it is sincere. The author elaborated by recommending the avoidance of Baroque punctuation, a sin whose definition seemed to vary with the century. "Baroque punctuation," he said. Miss Blodgett made a small face. "One era's flourish is another's standard. We have tried to remain at a decent mezzo." He asked to see the parcel wrapping, if any had survived. She produced from under the counter a fold of brown paper, saved by instinct rather than policy. A label, typed again, announced, "Lowminster Library, gift to be placed discreetly in adult non-fiction. The commas, once more, were pressed. Along the edge of the paper, a thin smear of something waxy remained. A furniture polish, perhaps, or the memory of a drawer in which packages were prepared at leisure and without apology. Dr. Tolland, he suggested. He admires drawers, said Miss Blodgett, but he admires rules more. If he were to polish a parcel, he would write a notice explaining why. An elderly borrower approached to return a volume on Roman Britain that had not changed since last century and did not see why it should. Miss Blodgett received it with sympathy, stamped a date with the gentleness of a blessing, and directed the gentleman toward rail timetables, which had been known to console the bereaved. "Do these donations irritate you?" asked Purbright, when the desk had resumed its neutrality. "They educate me," she said. "I'm reminded that the town is being improved in areas where improvement is inconvenient. It is the prerogative of widows and committees to make us tidy by stealth." "Would you say the typewriter in question is shared?" She folded her hands, which were intelligent in the librarian's way, quietly decisive. "I would say the machine is less borrowed than visited. An altar at which several officiate. They bring their own ribbons and their own indignations. They leave behind commas." Purbright allowed this to settle among his other small truths. He asked to keep a copy of the letter, and Miss Blodgett, whose idea of property had never included paper, made one with the staff machine, apologizing for the ribbon's reticence. The duplicate revealed, even faint, the crimp of the comma dents. The habit had impressed itself through. "Dr. Tolland," she added, unprompted, as she clipped the copy to a folded note of her own, "has lately been advising the school on presentation. The minutes of governors' meetings arrive at the library for binding. The last set contained an appendix. On the proper tone of circulars." I could not tell whether he was writing a rule or a confession. "Is he in this afternoon?" "He comes on Thursdays," she said. "Today is Wednesday. On Wednesdays he advises himself somewhere else." Purbright stood, thanked her with a manner that declined to be observed, and slid the letter into his case where laminations and scruples had already formed a society. At the corner of the desk, a rubber eraser rested on a square of paper. The eraser's edges had been cleaned with the librarian's fastidiousness. The crumbs, those faint white evidences of standards being maintained, had been swept into a neat little heap and left, one suspected, as a lesson. He paused beside the etiquette trolley. In Volume 5, chapter on Community Correspondence, a penciled line, thin as a thought, had been struck through the sentence, "Anonymous letters are seldom useful." Beneath it, in the same faint hand, someone had written, "Unless written by the right sort of person." The comment had then been almost erased. "Who has been doing that?" he asked, because it would have been rude to say nothing. "We all do it," said Miss Blodgett quietly. "We are the right sort of person until we are seen." In the entrance hall, the notice board displayed a small card. "Library thanks its friends." The type was justified oddly neatly for a public sign, the commas obedient. A penciled correction at the margin, moved, then erased, had left a bruise no one had thought to hide. Purbright looked at the bruise. He considered, as he had in other rooms, the question of who had taught Lowminster to tidy its traces so scrupulously that the tidying had become the trace. Outside, the afternoon managed a pale serviceability. Across the square, buntings exhibited tins of black ribbon in a pyramid that could have served as a short sermon on restraint. A boy pushed open the library door with a silence wiser than his age. Purbright waited for the door to close behind him before he turned toward the school offices. The letter in his case shifted as he moved, the way evidence adjusts itself to be useful. He walked slowly, because slow was the speed at which the town admitted what it was doing. Behind him, the library resumed its convalescence, attended by a woman who believed standards required an eraser and who had, in a moment of unguarded precision, admitted that friendship in Lowminster often announced itself by disappearing. Ahead, somewhere between a borrowed machine and a shared intention, a circle of the like-minded pressed their commas as if pauses could keep everyone decent. The inspector entertained a small, useful question: whether the machine was teaching the people or the people teaching the machine, and which pupil would misbehave first. Planning met in a side room of the council offices whose windows had been taught not to invite views. The table was the color of municipal conviction, and its edges had been rubbed to a satin by sleeves that believed in points of order. On the wall, a map of Lowminster, faintly yellowed and pocked with drawing pins, pretended to be current. The air was a mixture of paper, polish, and a draft that had long ago taken minutes. Mr. Venn, chair of the planning subcommittee, was the sort of man who kept a pencil in his pocket as if it were a principle. He addressed the agenda with care, pronouncing each item so that it started life properly named. At his right sat Mrs. Oddie, who considered herself indispensable to a quorum. At his left, the clerk, Miss Crate, whose talents included making bolted facts appear agreeable. Inspector Purbright, present by invitation and habit, had chosen a chair half back from the table, where observation could be mistaken for participation. Item 4, Extensions and Alterations, brought Mr. Pallister forward. He stood with his cap in hand and his expression arranged into that mild civic unhappiness which is as traditional in English planning as drainage. He described, with the brevity of a man who does not trust, adjectives, a proposal to extend his kitchen by the width of a man and a chair, and to replace a rear door whose hinges had ceased to believe in future. Miss Crate lifted a sheet. "An objection has been received," she said, and her tone suggested that objections, like rain, were acceptable so long as they did not get into anything. The correspondent styles itself House with no address. It argues that the proposed brickwork will embarrass history and that the lane behind number 12 ought not to be subjected to a modern profile. "The lane," said Mrs. Oddie, who entertained embarrassment as policy, "has long borne burdens. We are its guardians." Mr. Venn drew a neat line upon his pad, the bureaucrat's version of a sigh. "Let us hear the rest," Miss Crate read. The objection was calm, exact, and phrased in that learned courtesy which contends without perspiration. It proposed that materials be chosen with gratitude, and that the silhouette remain loyal to the memory of a simpler appetite. The commas were pressed into the paper as if pauses had been installed rather than invited. "Embarrass history," repeated Mr. Venn, intrigued by the phrase and wary of its uses. "History does not blush in Lowminster," said Mrs. Oddie. "It merely withdraws." Pallister, who had never yet embarrassed anything on purpose, looked at the floorboards as if they might intercede. "I only thought to put in a bit more room," he said, "so that a man taking his tea doesn't have to choose between elbow and bread." Purbright asked, as one asks a friend to bring salt, if he might see the envelope. Miss Crate provided it with the equanimity of a clerk who knows envelopes are not to be argued with. Eversley stock, stamped square, lavender that had chosen drawers over fields. Along the back, a pressure at the lower corner, the little triangle once more, where some ringless forefinger had steadied the knife, preferring habit to accident. Inside, the letter carried the familiar carbon's sheen in its lower margin, a whisper of duplication not admitted publicly. Mr. Venn cleared his throat and made for compromise as water finds the lowest place. "Perhaps the extension might be permitted in principle," he suggested, "subject to brickwork of commensurate character and roofline not conspicuous from the lane." "I am not conspicuous," said Pallister, with the quiet conviction of a man who has practiced it, "and I should like my door to agree." "Brick samples," said Mrs. Oddie, "may be presented. We cannot take responsibility for silhouettes that have had modern notions." They moved to questions of eaves. The committee nodded, discovered agreement where habit kept it, and resolved that if Pallister would bring a choice of bricks to the next sitting, they might dare to be satisfied in public. He accepted this as he accepted weather. During a pause in which Mrs. Oddie rounded up the next item with a shepherd's gesture, Purbright turned to Pallister in the tone of a man asking the hour. "You have been kind to the council in other errands," he said. "Deliveries, for example." Pallister nodded, ruefully proud. "I take the council bag mornings," he said. "I'm going that way, and it seems wasteful to leave legs idle. I carry for Mrs. Dearden sometimes, only to save her steps, Inspector. She has a knee that dislikes charity." "Envelopes." "Sealed," he said. "Handed to me in a manner that suggests I'm either trustworthy or a sin. I don't look. I take them to Miss Pegg, and she looks at the corner and says thank you to the table." "And signatures?" asked Purbright. "I fetched one last week." "For uniformity," he said, as though quoting a receipt. "Dr. Tolland's name for a notice. Something about presentation. He has a way with letters that makes them stand up straighter." Where was the paper waiting for him? "At the library table," said Pallister, "under a book whose sense had already been decided. Miss Blodgett told me to tell him not to be clever in the margin." "You didn't open it," said Purbright. "I don't open other people's manners," said Pallister, which appeared to settle that. Items resumed. A fence wished to be taller, a hedge preferred to be municipal, a sign had without permission learned to shout. The committee encouraged, discouraged, and adjourned all three with equal modesty. When the room had thinned to the modestly conscientious, Purbright asked Miss Crate very lightly if he might admire her out-tray. "My out-tray," she repeated, pleasure and suspicion finding each other. "It is a poor thing, Inspector, but my own." He inspected it in situ, the way one admires a harbour for being the end of rivers. There were carbons cut into honest strips, a pad of flimsy paper clips that had sworn off melodrama. Beneath a memorandum about white lines for a bend that nobody could be persuaded to dislike, a carbon revealed, by pressure rather than ink, an imprint of words from some other letter. "Maintain standards." He tilted the sheet. The phrase turned legible like a watermark that had thought better of coyness. The words had been rehearsed. They felt learned before they were believed. "Useful phrase," he said. "It turns difficult things into policy," replied Miss Crate, who preferred her difficulties on stationery. "People accept policy. They wrestle with requests." "Who typed it?" "I type what is brought to me," she said, "and sometimes what is brought to me has already been typed. I make a carbon out of respect." "Respect for whom?" "For the person who will be asked to remember. It is easier to remember what has been given 2 chances. He replaced the carbon with the consideration given to sleeping animals. On her machine, the office's, he pressed the comma key and felt the character land with the steady modesty of modern mechanisms. The heavy overstrike did not belong here. It belonged, as his fingertips had learned, to the other device, the one shared, borrowed, visited, committee altar rather than office tool. Pallister stood to one side with his cap in the attitude of a smaller hat. "Inspector," he said, "am I to be refused?" "You are to be reassured," said Purbright, "and, in due course, permitted. By history. By brickwork that won't embarrass it," said the inspector. "Bring 3 samples. 2 will be refused on principle. The 3rd will be approved because nobody has quarrel with number 3. "Thank you," said Pallister, in a tone that contained modest awe for the science of public life. Out in the corridor, planning's notice board leaned towards transparency. On it, a pinned card announced, "Subcommittee is resolved to maintain standards." The line was justified more sharply than such signs usually are. A penciled comma had once been added and then nearly erased. The bruise remained. a little cloud where caution had been exercised with an eraser that had learnt tact. "Your phrase travels, Miss Crate," said Purbright as they came to the door. "It travels because it takes no luggage," she said. "Everyone believes they own it." He walked with Pallister as far as the steps. The man looked at the sky in the way people look at roofs they do not mend, with goodwill and resignation. "Mrs. Dearden," Purbright said, as if recalling a pleasantry, "prefers not to be seen asking favours." "She prefers to be seen thanked," said Pallister, with a simplicity that made commentary impertinent. "There is a difference. I don't mind being her legs. I admire knees that have retired. And Dr. Tolland?" "He signs the town," said Pallister, "so that it will know itself in print." When the widower had gone, upright as an old fence line, Purbright returned to Miss Crate's desk on the pretext of admiring the blotter. On its surface, in the lower right, were the faintest regular impressions of commas pressed hard enough to leave half-moons. The office machine had not made them. He wondered whether a borrowed sheet, already part-typed elsewhere, had been laid upon this blotter to be addressed or folded. People carry their habits with them. The blotter had accepted those habits, as the town did, without filing an objection. Miss Crate, observing nothing and everything, offered him a small packet. "Brick permit forms?" she said. "If Mr. Pallister completes them, we may practice benevolence while saving face." "Benevolence improves with paperwork," said Purbright. "It keeps it from becoming enthusiasm." She smiled, a thin, real thing, and lowered her voice, as if generosity might take fright. "Between ourselves, Inspector, Mr. Pallister's extension is harmless. The objection is not to brick, but to unauthorized comfort. Certain people think comfort spreads." "Like standards?" he asked. "Standards are comfort for those who wish to give it to others," she said, and then seemed to hear herself and take a step back indoors. He left the office by the side stairs where a window permitted a little civic humility to escape the building. From there, he could see the lane behind number 12, pavements used to practical shoes, back fences with their own opinions, a line of washing persuaded to be respectable by pegs. History, if present, had disguised itself as decency, he imagined, very briefly, Pallister's door opening without embarrassment, and decided that history would survive without consultation. At Bunton's window, a pyramid of ribbon tins repeated its homily on restraint. Across the square, the library's etiquette books had been placed with the care given to elderly relatives who might stir. Purbright crossed toward the church, cutting a diagonal customary in men who have taught themselves to arrive without drama. As he passed the pillar box, he noticed a pale smear near the slot, that furniture polishes discreet residue again. Another parcel, perhaps, addressed with humour to 0 High Street. The system, he thought without putting a fence round it, had clarified itself by refusing to be explicit. A rotating authorship. Mrs. Dearden's upright knee, Dr. Tolland's uniformity, Miss Orme's clean ribbon, shielded by common stationery and a single style learned long ago in an alderman's drawing room. The style travelled. Ownership stayed at home. What was shared collectively was owned privately by someone with a taste for invisible influence. One could almost hear the advice given in that room years earlier. If you write it properly, people will read it as policy, and see the nods, earnest, intelligent, relieved. Back at the station, he set the planning objection beside the library letter and the Institute's admonition, arranging them not as a collector but as a man laying out garments to see which ones had been made by the same tailor. Under the desk lamp, the indentations and commas aligned like the buttons of a uniform. On the objection's reverse, lower left, that triangular mark again, a tiny geography of fingers and knife. He reached for his pen and wrote a short list on the inside cover of the folder. Pallister, delivers, Dearden, fetches, signature, Tolland, no curiosity, clerk's out tray, carbon bruise, maintain standards, public card, same phrase, pencil erase. He did not underline, Underlining believes itself urgent. Then he paused, held very briefly by a question that had not yet completed its sentence. If the phrase was rehearsed, where had it been drilled? And who listened for the wrong note? He found himself thinking of Mrs. Cleeve's hallway of improvements, of a drawing-room where drawers smelt of polish and letters learned to be themselves in private before improving anyone else in public. The clock on the station wall chose duty over, charm. Purbright closed the folder with that quiet finality which in other men signals closure. In him, it protected a space in which a thought could grow without being startled. The subcommittee would have its bricks. Pallister would learn which color did not embarrass history. The town would sleep better for having done nothing rash. He, too, would sleep, without conviction, but with order. And in the space between the two he would keep a small, unspent inquiry, whether maintain standards had ceased to be advice and become a password, and if so, who was manning the door. Imogen Cleeve's drawing-room arranged itself around you as if you were a subject being introduced to customs. The curtains admitted light with a discipline that had been explained to them. The furniture wore upholstery that looked like a compromise reached after long correspondence. On the mantel, a small clock, neither precious nor inattentive, rehearsed punctuality. The air held the odor that belongs to houses where wood has been persuaded to age tidily. Mrs. Cleeve poured tea the way certain people pour reputation, steadily and with more ceremony than liquid. The cups were of that porcelain which believes thinness to be a creed. She attended to milk in the manner of someone tolerating a minor sin. "Do try the Madeira, Inspector," she said. "It is sturdier than the century." The cake, having been cut into equity, agreed. Purbright took the chair she allowed him. Neither the best nor the worst, because one learns more from a room by sitting where it expects you. He declined sugar, which he imagined would be counted. Across the hearth rug Mrs. Cleeve arranged herself, a woman whose widowhood had replaced glamour with authority and found it more comfortable. Her hair had discovered the exact line between permanence and vanity. Her hands, unringed, had adopted a style of correctness the town had come to copy in public. "I'm told," she began, after settling the spoon in its saucer, as if to show the spoon how civility worked, "that you are taking an interest in our local habit of invisible improvement." "I am told," said Purbright, "that improvement, like certain benefactors, prefers the back door." "One must never embarrass gratitude," she replied. "Lowminster, Inspector, is a community susceptible to blushes and amnesia. My husband attempted to correct both. He left, in place of sermons, a legacy of order. The trust was intended to keep the town from dissolving into an anecdote." "Anecdotes," said Purbright, "are how places take revenge on history." Indeed. She tasted her tea and discovered that it had met its standard. The endowment allows us to assist, modestly and without parade, those bodies that constitute a town's backbone. The library, the institute, the church committee, even planning when it remembers its manners. Money does not improve people, Inspector. It improves the areas in which they might remember to improve themselves. "No brass plaques then," said Purbright. "Plaques are what the self-congratulatory leave for the lazy to dust," said Mrs. Cleeve. "We leave paper. Paper has the courtesy to be filed." He glanced, not too openly, around the room. Several writing surfaces seemed to exist as examples to themselves. On the bureau, a blotter rested under a bone-handled knife whose edge showed the faintest triangular nick, accumulated by years of teaching envelopes where to surrender. A vase held a formal bouquet whose scent came from drawers rather than fields. Against the wall, a small bookcase supported etiquette, minutes, and those local histories compiled by citizens convinced that propriety could be documented. "Tell me," she continued, "whether I must defend myself. I shall be disappointed, but not unpracticed." "I am merely visiting," said Purbright. "At first I thought to visit your trust, but the trust has begun to visit me. That is its success. she said, with the quiet of a person who has explained something many times and enjoys having to do it again. No. She sat back the necessary inch. I have not written any letters. Not one. I have, however, smoothed a number. There is a difference between composition and correction. Composition breeds vanity. Correction breeds tone. And the house with no address? Asked Purbright, as if introducing a third person to the conversation. A convenience, she said. It allows those who dislike exposure to perform decently. A house is where standards live, Inspector, not where they are visited. Anonymity, he observed, is a treacherous tenant. People, she returned, do better when they cannot be thanked. Names become trophies, houses become stages, gratitude becomes a bill. I prefer to charge no one and have the accounts in order. She reached to the table beside her and took up a sheet of Eversley stock. The watermark announced itself only to those who had taught themselves to see. You notice the paper, she said. It reduces the temptation to throw things away. She did not hand him the sheet. It served its purpose by being available. Others, he said, have written in the house's hand. Others, she corrected, have written in their own hands and in the town's idea of itself. Mrs. Dearden is a pillar. Pillars, as a rule, prefer an inscription but will accept an invitation. She sends notes when knees forbid marches. Dr. Tolland is a governor. Governors govern more securely on paper. He signs what already agrees with him. Even Miss Orme, who belongs to music, will occasionally bring commas to heel. And you, smooth. I keep the tone, she said, as if that were the title of a parish office. If something is to have authority, it must not appear to have been pleased by its own existence. I alter exuberance into patience, encourage the margin to behave, prevent adjectives from assaulting nouns. The overstruck comma, he suggested lightly. She allowed herself the simplest smile, as though acknowledging a student who had not disgraced himself. A habit of the older schoolroom, one impressed the pause just enough to show one had meant it. There is an impression in the town, said Purbright, of unity, letters that do not quarrel with each other, phrases that pass from notice board to magazine to subcommittee as if by instinct. It is called agreement, she said. The moderns dislike it because it cannot be applauded on their devices. She set down her cup. Inspector, my husband served on committees when committees were still confident that civilization was an outcome rather than a slogan. Here, she indicated the low table at her elbow, are the cards we produced when secrecy became a courtesy. People who wished to be improved without being interviewed could use them. On the table lay a stack of pre-addressed cards, the cream facing that had been described by more than one grateful clerk. House with no address, the type read, precise and faintly amused. Beneath, in smaller letters, correspondence to be directed to matters, not persons. The commas were pressed into the card, as if to console it for being handled. At the corner, the printer had left a minute guiding Nick, a triangle, where a knife might meet a habit. Purbright did not reach for one. He did not have to. They had already explained themselves. You distribute these? He asked. I leave them where they will be useful, she said. The library, the vestry, the institute. Planning. A house should be hospitable. And people use them, he said, to write what they believe, then bring their paper to you to be smoothed. Sometimes they bring drafts, she said. Sometimes they bring results. Sometimes, if a sentence is too sure of itself, they do not bring it at all. She turned her head slightly, which in her amounted to generosity. You must not imagine this is manipulation, Inspector. It is husbandry. Left to themselves, committees develop adjectives. Left to others, he returned, committees adopt passwords. Maintain standards, for instance. A necessary incantation, said Mrs. Cleeve, with the unsentimental affection some people reserve for handkerchiefs. If one repeats it, a number of unnecessary things failed to occur. Who first repeated it? Alderman Cleeve, she said. He used to tell younger men that standards are what allow us to quarrel profitably. Without standards, quarrels waste time and produce music. She considered and removed the last word. Noise, she amended. They spoke then of smaller matters, how the library had learned to bind its gratitude, how the Institute's kettle had been rescued from martyrdom by a tepid replacement, how planning had been persuaded to defer comfort until it could be described without envy. She did not admit to influence, she admitted to taste. Do forgive me this question, said Purbright, with a tone elastic enough to contain it if it misbehaved. Do you ever regret what is done in the house's name? I regret, she said. What is done without a name at all? Cowardice passing as wit. The house is not wit. It is a mirror. People write to it when they are tired of hearing their own signatures. And when the house is wrong. She poured herself a little more tea. Ceremony justified the addition. Then the town will be right later, she said. It has time. We have only tone. He set down his cup. You have managed, Mrs. Cleeve, a choir. Not managed, she said quickly, because pride must not be caught. Encouraged. Lowminster has a perfectly good ear, but too many soloists. If we sing in unison, at least the words are heard. At the cost, said Purbright, of harmony. Harmony, she replied, is what people plead for when they wish not to be corrected. He allowed this to stand. On the far table a vase reflected, in a small and dignified way, the room's conviction. Against a leather folder, a pair of black ribbon tins had been stacked with the politeness of a pyramid. The tins were the stationer's brand he had seen in the square window, arranged now as if they were comrades off duty. You will find no scandal here, Inspector, she said, not unkindly. Only the daily administration of decency. I'm frank about it because secrecy, once it becomes shy, begins to lie. You have not written any letters, he repeated. I have not, she said. I have smoothed a number. No one asks me to smooth unless they wish the world to look at what they have written without looking at them. I consider it a service. If I desire applause, I will visit the cemetery and listen to my husband's name. He stood. She did not. She inclined the fraction of an inch that substitutes, in people like her, for rising. On their way to the hall, they passed a small side table that had achieved neatness without appearing drafted. On it lay a bundle of envelopes, unsealed, the flaps enjoying the brief freedom before duty. A faint lavender rose from them. The return slips were blank with intention. A tiny triangular dent marked each lower left corner where a knife would find its cue. Purbright paused over none of this. He admired a print instead, a view of Lowminster Church, the spire in the exact mood chosen by committees. We are, you see, said Mrs. Cleeve, hearing the quiet, a parish. At times, he said, an address. In the hall, the light had the good manners that often belong to second rooms. The table by the door supported a lacquer tray, a porcelain dog that had never been loved, and the stack of cards he had been shown in miniature moments earlier. Up close, the type revealed a small eccentricity. The O of no carried a minute. Hairline inside, as if a cracked type had been replaced by one that still remembered its predecessor. Someone had noticed. Someone had decided the flaw gave character. If one would, said Mrs. Cleeve, indicating the cards with a neutral hand. They are for the improvement of conversation. He lifted the top card, light, rigid, confident, and read again, House with no address. Beneath, in italic modesty, requests should carry their reasons with them. The phrase had traveled from the library notice board to the planning corridor and found its rest here. He placed the card in his pocket as one pockets a visiting card from a house where the family is not at home when you call. Inspector, she said, a courtesy properly placed, do let me know if any secrecy becomes unhelpful. I'm inclined to regret that. I shall, he said, though I have the impression secrecy here is arranged to be helpful first." "It is arranged," she said, "to be polite." At the door, as she sat to write a note to accompany a parcel to the Institute, ribbons, plain, modest, her pen made those loops he had learnt in other rooms. They moved forward with pleasant insistence, a hand accustomed to instructing nouns. She blotted the line with unnecessary care, as if to show the blotter what it was for, and addressed the envelope in a style that had taught the town how to behave under post. He left with his hat, being what hats are where doors have considered them. Outside, Lowminster presented the hour it gives to citizens who have been behaved to. The square held a thorough moderation. In his pocket, the card lay cool, and addressed carefully not being one. He walked toward the gate without making the mistake of haste. On the gravel, the faintest remnant of furniture polish traveled up as a smell at the height of shoes. He had noticed it in the library parcels. He had smelt it on the pillar box. He had met it in planning's out tray where paper learned to mean whatever it had been told. The drawn-out note accompanied him to the pavement, and then became, as civility does, indistinguishable from air. He turned once, not ostentatiously, to regard the house. From an upper window, the edge of a curtain acknowledged the town with the smallest professional dip. The clock on the mantel, several rooms away, kept its appointment with the minute. He considered, without deciding to, a question that had walked alongside him out of the drawing-room. Whether a town that sings in unison remembers the words or only the tune, and whether, in Lowminster, someone had begun to hum a different line under their breath. He did not look back again. The card in his pocket made the correct weight against his coat, and the street, practicing reason, received him. The parish annual general meeting occupied the church hall in the way annual things do. Reassuringly, and with a misgiving that could be itemized. Folding chairs, having enjoyed their year in seclusion, submitted to duty. A table at the front had been covered with a cloth whose whiteness proposed neutrality. The urn, rehabilitated since its sulking period, breathed as if converted to moderation. Minutes lay in neat stacks like small sandwiches of last year's appetite. Outside, dusk took its time, which Lowminster approved of in weather and men. Inspector Purbright arrived with the manner of a person who has no business but would happily advise. He chose a seat along the side aisle that gave a clear view of faces when they remembered to be careful. The vicar, Reverend Chivers, presided from the centre with a benevolence practised into habit. On his right sat the council chairman, Mr. Lockett, wearing his invisible chain with an invisible sense of ceremony. On his left, the clerk, Miss Pegg, possessed her fountain pen like an anodyne. The front row contained Mrs. Dearden of the Women's Institute, erect even when seated, Miss Blodgett of the library, whose calm could have been bottled, and Dr. Tolland, the school governor, in a suit that had decided what it was years ago. Behind them, the town arranged itself with decent curiosity. They began, as all such meetings must, by congratulating minutes on being correct. Miss Pegg read them with that soothing accuracy which dispenses with evidence. The motion about the kettle's replacement was remembered. The thank you to anonymous donors was applauded with a sense of thrift. The council's sympathy for vergers was reaffirmed. Approval travelled round the room in a murmur that could be relied upon. Then came matters arising, which in Lowminster was a room with more doors than people. It was here, just before the urn's first intermission, that Reverend Chivers, who believed bravery ought to be unshowy, cleared his throat and offered the floor to Inspector Purbright for a few remarks of clarification that may help our housekeeping. Purbright stood without hurrying. He carried no papers. Information sat well enough in his pockets. He spoke with the unheated patience Lowminster found most persuasive, as if he were by nature incapable of steam. "We have, in the past months," he began, "benefited from a certain industriousness of conscience addressed from a house that does not give its address. It has helped roof appeals, nourished minutes with cutlery and commas, and corrected a number of silhouettes fore and aft. This is no charge. It is inventory. I am here to describe a habit. He allowed the word to belong to the room a moment. The habit is this. Thoughtful citizens, preferring their influence tidier than their names, have used common stationery, a familiar type, and a tone learned in rooms where standards have long been rehearsed. Envelopes arrived as if they wished to be kept. Commas were overstruck with that education one acquires in older offices. Phrases traveled, maintained standards among them as a kind of passport between groups already in agreement. He said nothing then, which allowed a number of people to find themselves in the middle of his sentences. Minutes were shuffled discreetly. Coughs composed themselves. Shoes located something interesting on the floor. Even the urn produced a small, thoughtful click. The result, Purbright continued, has been improvement without ownership, generosity without the inconvenience of thanks, guidance without the awkwardness of invitation. What is admirable in intention has become confusing in practice. A town may share a style. It ought, in my experience, to sign its advice. Mrs. Dearden's hand, held as if for piano, rose. "Inspector," she said, "if I may." Her voice was firm and reflexively representative. "Should the Institute be thought to have written any such correspondence, I offer to resign from everything at once, in order that propriety need not be embarrassed by my knees." There was a small ripple of reassurance from the back, where women who did not yet own committees had learned to encourage those who did. Purbright inclined his head. "No resignations are in order, Mrs. Dearden," he said. "What is in order is signatures. Letters, like kettles, pour better when they declare themselves." Dr. Tolland cleared his throat in the way principals announce a moral without naming it. "If circulars have been issued in a tone that may have appeared to be the town's, it is because tone is the only way to prevent an argument becoming a discussion." "Quite," said Purbright. "But the address should be visible when the tone arrives, or the discussion never gets its chance to be an argument." Miss Blodgett, who disliked melodrama in both novels and people, suggested that the library has no objection to gratitude attaching itself to persons, so long as names are spelt with composure. "That," said Purbright, "is precisely my point." From the second row, Mr. Pallister lifted a modest hand. "If I have carried any envelopes whose legs were not explained to me," he said, "I apologize to the council for my knees." "You have carried them admirably," said Purbright, "and we are all obliged to your knees." Mrs. Cleeve, who had been listening with the attentiveness of someone whose standards have been put on the table and found edible, rose only after the others sat. She poured the air around her into calm. "It may be," she said, "that a legacy of order, devised to prevent Lowminster becoming a footnote, has strayed into imitation. If I have smooth letters—" Here she paused, faintly and deliberately. It was to ensure tone. A legacy should not impersonate a conscience. If the town is to be improved, it must improve itself in its own names, which it plainly possesses. "I am grateful for the admission," said Purbright, and made it sound like a kindness returned. Mr. Lockett conferred quietly with his chain, and the chain confirmed his judgment. "Very well," he said. "The council will agree, if you like, that objections without addresses will henceforth be read after tea, and considered no more binding than weather. We shall accept anonymous money only in cash and as an embarrassment. Letters of guidance will be entertained if the sender has the courage to be thanked. Miss Pegg, minute us with dignity." Miss Pegg had already done so. Dignity lay reflective on the paper. Tea followed, as it must, because morality dissolves without it. People spoke in lower voices than usual, the way they do in rooms where confession has crossed the carpet without tripping. Mrs. Dearden was persuaded, by friends and by a plate of safely reputable sandwiches, to resign from nothing and to sign her letters with that legible conviction she had been practicing for years. Dr. Tolland allowed that uniformity could survive a signature. Miss Orme, who had come in late and stood near the hatch like a well-bred metronome, accepted 2 cups with the unargumentative air of someone whose commas had been implicated without surprise. Purbright, carrying tea as carefully as the occasion, found himself beside the vicar at the urn. The reverend's smile had adopted its pastoral hinge. "Civilization," he murmured, "has been asked to speak up." "It will," said Purbright. "It enjoys the sound of its own reason." He set his cup down to study the notice board. A new card had been pinned to it in tidy type. "Council welcomes suggestions. Courteous identification. Assists resolution." Above the last word, the ghost of a rubbed-out comma lingered like a memory unwilling to leave. He touched the card lightly, the way one pats a patient chair, and returned to his seat. Business resumed with a softening of the shoulders. Accounts were passed with only 2 brief excursions into principles. The calendar for the fête made its seasonal appearance and then took its seasonal leave. Under any other business, someone asked whether one could be anonymous in a raffle. The room decided no, but that luck would continue to be discreet. When the meeting closed, properly without triumph, people left in that precise disorder only English rooms achieve. On the steps, Mrs. Cleeve waited just long enough to be seen not to be waiting. "Inspector," she said, "you have steered us between vanity and inefficiency." "I suspect the current was doing most of the work," he replied. "Current," she said, "is what the town calls habit when it prefers not to confess." She gave him a small card, hers, not the house's, with an address that had never been anything else. Then she excused herself by explaining that the endowment's correspondence must learn to be less agreeable. The week adjusted to the meeting the way cats adjust to the rearrangement of furniture, by pretending it had been their idea and looking briefly put out. The parish magazine printed on its back page, where corrections practice humility, a notice: "Donations will carry names or none at all." The line under it, "We thank our friends," declared an undeck, broke off, and on the copy in Purbright's drawer, one could see the pencil mark where "undeclared" had been considered and then, chastely, erased. At the library, a fresh bookplate appeared. From Mrs. Dearden, on behalf of the Institute, and Miss Blodgett, who never praised rebels rashly, allowed her index finger to approve. Planning, for its part, found new energy in brick samples. Mr. Pallister's 3rd selection, a human shade of red, failed to embarrass history, which seemed relieved to have avoided attention. The pillar box stopped smelling of furniture polish and resumed its traditional scent of weather. Bunton's display of ribbon tins diminished to an orderly deficiency. At the church hall, the kettle's new spout behaved without requiring martyrdom. Commas, though not in retreat, appeared more relaxed. On a Tuesday afternoon, one of those that choose to be neither wet nor decided, Sergeant Malley delivered to Purbright's desk a postcard, with the caution normally reserved for delicate pastries. It was not from anywhere, which was in keeping. The picture showed a seaside terrace that believed in summers the nation had mislaid. On the reverse, in a hand that had learnt to be legible without presuming, were 6 words: "Home can be anywhere, if one is careful." There was no signature. The stamp sat upright, underlined by nothing. The postmark was a smudge that might have been local air. Purbright read it through twice, as one reads instructions that are trying not to be. He put the card beside his folder of envelopes, where the triangular dents rested with their patient geometry. He did not attempt to inventory the satisfaction he felt. Satisfactions are improved by undercounting. Later, he walked to the window and observed Lowminster deploying its afternoon. A mother maneuvered a pram with the literacy of a baker. An elderly man rehearsed a turn toward the newsagent. Miss Pegg crossed the square with an expression that suggested minutes going home. A thrill, which in other towns would have called itself excitement, moved through his mind and found it was not required. On his desk, The pen he used for lists waited without anxiety. He took it up and wrote, without capitals, names or none at all. He drew a small box beside the words and filled it with a single line. He then put the pen down with that care people give to things that have not betrayed them. He had presented no charges. He had outlined a habit. The town had cleared its throat and agreed that the future would be better written if it were written by people. Whether the house would withdraw politely, become a cottage with a name, or learn to send flowers only to funerals remained outside his occupation. One does not arrest civility. He lifted the postcard once more and considered the modesty of its claim. Anywhere might be exactly where Lowminster preferred to live, providing it could be done under supervision. He smiled, because the room was empty and would not imitate him, and slid the card into the file between the first envelope and the newest correction. The fit was exact. As he locked the drawer, an action more ceremonial than defensive, another thought presented itself, not so much sharp as punctual. If home can be anywhere, one must choose where to stand before speaking. In the corridor, the clock adopted the minute without fanfare. The inspector, who had always liked clues that behaved like manners, turned out his light and left the office to consider itself.